Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. It was a simple routine, a daily ritual that I had come to rely on. After school, I would make my way to the bus stop, insert my coin into the machine, and climb aboard. The journey was a familiar one, a soothing rhythm of the bus's engine, the gentle sway of the vehicle, and the comforting hum of the city passing by. I was just a young teenager then, a time of innocence and exploration. The world was a vast, exciting place, filled with endless possibilities. The bus ride was my escape, a chance to lose myself in the pages of a book or the lyrics of a song. But one day, that familiar routine took a sinister turn. I noticed a man sitting a few seats away, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a bald head and a perpetually creased brow. His gaze was unsettling, almost predatory, and it made the uncomfortable doubt at first. I tried to ignore him, to convince myself that I was being overly cautious. Perhaps he was simply lost in thought, or maybe he had recognized me from somewhere. But as the days turned into weeks, his unwavering attention became a constant source of unease. I began to avoid his gaze, pretending to be engrossed in my book or gazing out the window. I even considered changing my route, but the thought of altering my routine was unsettling. I was determined to confront my fear and continue my daily commute. One afternoon, as I was waiting for the bus, I saw him again. He was standing a few feet away, his eyes scanning the crowd. My heart pounded in my chest as I boarded the bus and tried to find a seat away from him. But no matter where I went, his gaze seemed to follow me. I tried to muster up the courage to confront him, to ask him why he was staring at me. But the words wouldn't come. Fear had paralyzed me, and I was too afraid to speak. As the weeks went on, the situation became increasingly intolerable. I felt like I was being hunted, a prey trapped in a cage. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as I was walking home from my grandmother's house, I saw him again. He was standing at the bus stop, his eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me as I quickened my pace, hoping to lose him in the crowd. But he was relentless, following me down the street. I turned a corner, hoping to lose him, but he was right behind me. I began to run, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat dripping down my face as I raced down the street. Just as I thought I had escaped him, I heard his voice behind me. "Wait," he called out, "I just want to talk to you." I kept running, my legs burning with exertion. I didn't dare to look back, afraid of what I might see. I ran until I reached my grandmother's house, where I burst through the door, gasping for breath. My grandmother was startled by my sudden arrival. She looked at me with concern, her eyes wide with worry. I told her everything that had happened, my voice trembling with fear. She listened patiently, her face growing increasingly grave. "We can't let this continue," she said. "We need to report this to the police." I nodded, my voice a mere whisper. I was terrified, but I knew that I couldn't let this go on. The next day, my grandmother accompanied me to the police station. We explained the situation to the officer, who listened attentively. He assured us that they would investigate the matter and take appropriate action. As we left the police station, I felt a sense of relief. I knew that I had done the right thing, and that I was no longer alone. The ordeal had been terrifying, but it had also taught me the importance of standing up for myself and seeking help when needed. From that day forward, I was more cautious about my surroundings. I avoided taking the bus alone, and I always kept an eye out for strangers. The experience had left a lasting mark on me, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows. To give some context to my story, it was summer 2019, and I was having a sleepover at my best friend's house, just like we always did. We were both 15 at the time, and she lived in a small village where everybody knew each other. Unfortunately, her family didn't have all the ingredients we needed, so we made the decision to head to the nearest convenience store. It was only a 5-minute walk, but it was pitch dark because there were no street lights along the road. Still, we weren't worried. We were laughing, talking about everything and nothing as we made our way down the street. On one side of the road stood a massive old church, built in the late 1800s. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, but they couldn't tear it down because it was considered historical. In front of the church was a huge parking lot, dimly lit by these eerie orange lights. Across the street was the store we needed to get to Dot as we passed the sidewalk in front of the church. We heard something strange classical music, faint like a whisper. We glanced toward the parking lot, and that's when we saw him. Even now, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. There was no one else on the road, no cars, no people. It was completely still, and in the middle of that parking lot was a man. He was tall, disheveled, and absolutely filthy. His clothes were ripped, and he looked like he hadn't showered in months. But that wasn't the worst part. He was dancing, performing ballet-like moves to the haunting classical music playing in the air. At 10 p.m. on a random summer night, in a village where nothing like this ever happened, the moment we saw him, we panicked. Without saying a word, we immediately crossed the street, putting as much distance between ourselves and him as possible. Our hearts were racing as we hurried into the convenience store. Once inside, we quickly gathered what we needed and went to the cashier. We were so shaken that we told her about the man dancing in the church parking lot. The cashier looked confused and walked over to the window to take a look. But when she did, the parking lot was empty. There was no one there. Our fear spiked. We didn't have cell phones with us, so we couldn't call her dad to pick us up. With no other choice, we took a deep breath and decided to walk back. But instead of taking the main road, we cut through the neighborhood behind the store. It was quieter, with fewer people, and we hoped it would keep us far away from the man. As we walked, we kept looking over our shoulders, making sure we weren't being followed. Every sound made us jump. Once we finally reached the main road again, we almost had a heart attack. There he was. The man was dancing again, right on the sidewalk in front of my friend's house. His movements were slow and deliberate, and the same strange music seemed to hang in the air. I was so scared I started crying quietly. We turned around and quickly ducked back into the neighborhood, unsure of what to do. That's when my friend remembered that some kids from our school lived nearby. We made a beeline for one of their houses, hoping they'd help us. When we knocked on the door, a classmate answered, but he didn't believe us at first. It was almost 11 p.m., and he looked tired, annoyed even. But after seeing how scared we were, he must have realized we weren't joking. He reluctantly put on his shoes and agreed to walk us home. We told him everything that had happened as we made our way back toward the main street. But when we reached the sidewalk in front of her house, the man was gone. There was no trace of him anywhere. Our friend walked us to the front door, and we thanked him before locking ourselves inside the house. We immediately told her parents what had happened, but they just laughed. They thought we were overreacting, saying that it was one of the safest villages around and that we probably just imagined things. Even now, years later, we still have no idea who that man was or what he was doing in that parking lot. We were both 19 the last time we talked about it, and neither of us can explain what happened that night. All we know is that we don't go out after dark anymore. We've never seen him again, and I hope we never do. When I was about 9 or 10, I got invited to a classmate's birthday party at a swimming pool. There were around 20 kids in our class, and I'm pretty sure everyone was invited. Just so it's clear, I'm a boy out at some point. I got separated from the group and ended up alone with this girl. We weren't exactly close, but she was in my class, so I knew her. We were in a tunnel that connected the main wave pool to a lazy river, and nobody else was around. Out of nowhere, she lunged at me, grabbed my head, and held me underwater. I was a skinny kid, and she was bigger and tougher, a bit of a tomboy. I panicked and struggled, but she wouldn't let go. It must have been 20 seconds before I finally managed to break free. I came up coughing and sputtering in complete shock. I tried asking why she did it, but before I could get the words out, she lunged at me again, forcing my head underwater. This time it felt like an eternity, and I genuinely thought I might drown. I had to fight my way free once more. I couldn't swim at the time, but the water was only chest high. I started backpedaling, trying to get away from her. She was giggling like it was some kind of game, with this wild grin on her face. I kept my distance as best as I could, but she was closing in on me, desperate. I babbled something about going down the water slide together, hoping to distract her. It worked. She paused and seemed to think about it. I took the chance to get out of the tunnel and into the open where there were more people around. Feeling safer, I kept talking about how fun the slides were, even though she wasn't saying much, and had this strange look the whole time. After we went down the slides, I stuck with my friends for the rest of the day. Still shaken by what had happened, I never told anyone about it because, honestly, I felt embarrassed, admitting that a girl had nearly drowned me. I was afraid I'd get teased. Fast forward to adulthood, I learned that the same girl had turned out to be a psychopath. She got into a relationship with a woman who had kids from a previous relationship. Together they tortured the children, and one of them even died. She's now serving a life sentence in prison. When I told my friends about the incident at the pool, they didn't believe me. Maybe it was the way I casually joked that I was almost her first victim, but they thought I was making it up. Still, when I look back on it, it's chilling. If I hadn't fought her off or managed to distract her, I genuinely believe she might have killed me that day. When I was in my late teens, I worked at a small coffee shop in my city. This was right around the time smartphones started becoming popular, and I had just gotten my first phone and laptop. It felt like stepping into a new world, with so much information and connectivity at my fingertips. One of our regular customers at the coffee shop was a strange man who always made me feel uneasy. He was eccentric, to say the least, and gave off some seriously weird vibes. No matter how hot it was outside, and trust me, the summer heat was unbearable, he always wore layers of clothing and a large parka with faux for trim. It seemed out of place, especially with his sunglasses, which he never took off. I never saw his eyes. Every time he came in, he would rush from his car to the shop, shielding himself from the sun as if it burned him. Then he'd order almost everything on the menu, though he always claimed the food wasn't for him. He said he didn't even like what we serve, but there he was, buying half the menu every time. One day, as I was checking him out at the register, he leaned in closer than usual, his voice barely above a whisper. "You seem like a nice young woman," he said, his tone strangely soft. "I need to warn you about something. I'm not supposed to say this, but it's been weighing on my conscience." I was confused, but curious. "What is it?" I asked. "Do you have a computer or a smartphone?" He asked, his voice now more urgent. "Yes, I just got one," I replied, still unsure of where this conversation was heading. "Get rid of them immediately," he said, his face deadly serious. I blinked. Why's that?" He glanced around as if someone might be listening. "I have a friend with government ties. Nothing is private. The government is monitoring everything, your texts, your emails, all of it. It's all permanent." He told me they're planning to set up concentration-type camps in major U.S. cities, and they'll use the information on your devices to decide who goes and where they end up. "I've gotten rid of everything that can be traced to me. I'm leaving soon. Please be safe with that." He left. I was shaken, but also skeptical. I couldn't help but brush him off as some conspiracy nut. But his words stayed with me for a while, gnawing at the back of my mind. After I quit that job and started working as a hostess at a restaurant, I didn't give it much more thought. A year passed, and the strange man had all but faded from my memory. Then, one night, he came back into my life in the most unexpected way. I was standing at the host station, greeting and seating guests as usual, when a sleek limousine pulled up outside. A man got out, flanked by two large bodyguards. To my shock, it was him, the man from the coffee shop. But this time, he looked completely different. He was wearing a sharp tuxedo, and although he still had those same sunglasses on, there was an air of importance about him that hadn't been there before. He walked up to me and said, "You remember me?" I was startled, but I nodded. "Yes, I remember." "And do you remember what I told you?" he asked. Again. I nodded, my mind flashing back to his bizarre warning about phones and government camps. Without another word, he passed the host stand, his eyes, or rather, his sunglasses, scanning the restaurant, as if he were looking for something or someone. His bodyguards followed closely behind. He didn't stop, didn't talk to anyone else, just to examine every corner of the place. After a few minutes, he signaled his bodyguards, and they turned to leave. Before he walked out the door, he looked back at me and said, "Don't forget." Then he was gone, stepping back into the limousine and disappearing down the street. I never saw him again. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what his deal was. How did he know where I worked? How did he find me after I left the coffee shop? Maybe he asked someone at my old job, but even then, why go out of his way to make such a dramatic, flashy appearance just to remind me of something he said a year ago? I think about him every now and then, wondering whatever became of him. Was he just a paranoid man with too much time on his hands? Or was there something more to his warning? I guess I'll never know. I usually get over creepy encounters pretty quickly, but this one felt different from the rest. I live by a simple rule: be kind to everyone because you never know who might be dangerous. That approach had served me well most of the time, but in this case, it may have led me into a troubling situation. When I was 18, I worked as a lifeguard at a small pool. It was nothing fancy. Basically, I was just a babysitter for people of all ages. Often, when parents got tired of watching their kids, they would come to me and talk, treating me like a free therapist. They would share their problems, even though I was just there to watch the pool, not handle anyone's personal issues. One day, a man in his 50s showed up with his 2 children. Like many others, he struck up a conversation with me. At first, it was just small talk. He mentioned not letting his kids eat ketchup because it could clean rust off metal. But as the conversation went on, things took a strange turn. He started speaking negatively about one of his children. He complained about her weight, her temper, and even said that no boys would ever be interested in her. That last remark made me feel uneasy. I tried to suggest that he not talk about his daughter that way. To my surprise, he seemed to listen, and I felt a bit better, thinking I might have helped her in some small way. After all, dealing with a parent like that could be tough for any child. The next day, he returned to the pool, beaming with happiness. He thanked me, saying I was so good with kids because my words had apparently helped him. However, his conversation quickly shifted into something more unsettling. He began trashing his ex-wife, claiming she had most of the custody, and that their children ate fast food whenever they were with her. I stayed quiet because I felt it was not my place to interfere, and I did not want to create unnecessary drama at work. But then the red flags began. The conversation shifted again, and this time he started talking about how he wanted a young wife. It felt like he was trying to tell me he was single and hinting at his interest in me. This made me extremely uncomfortable, but I did my best to ignore it. As the days went by, he continued to show up at the pool every single day. It became increasingly obvious that he was coming just to see me. His questions started getting more personal, like asking where I usually did my grocery shopping and if there was a cafe near where I lived. I was certain he was trying to figure out where I lived, so I carefully avoided giving him any clear answers. During my last week at work, I had an afternoon shift. I asked my colleague who had worked the morning shift if anything unusual had happened. He told me that a man had been banned from the pool that day. Apparently, this man had reached behind the counter at the small pool shop, where we kept our personal belongings, trying to sneak a look at our work calendar. He had been denied access by my coworker, but then attempted to check it out in a more illegal way. That week, I saw the man twice at the end of my shifts, standing near the pool entrance. The second time, I reported him to the pool's security guards. After that, I never saw him again. So, to the man who crossed way too many boundaries, let's hope we never meet again, you creep. I have several unsettling stories that fit the let's not meet category, but I will start with the most recent one. Yesterday, I took my son fishing. He wanted to go to a nearby lake that we had not visited in a while. The area is not known for being great. For some context, the last time we were there, about a year ago, a car drove by and someone yelled, "Nice ass," at me while I was standing there with my young son. Unfortunately, this type of behavior is expected in the area. The lake is also a known spot for late-night hookups and drug deals. Because of the lake's reputation, I had made a deal with my dad that I would not stay there past 4 p.m. without him. Now, on to the story. My 12-year-old son, who looks much younger than his age, and I pulled up at our favorite fishing spot, a small pond across the road from the lake. Almost immediately, an older gentleman approached us and asked if there were any fish in the pond. I told him that we had just started, so we had not caught anything yet, but we had caught fish there on other occasions. He thanked me for the information and went back to his spot on the other side of the road. About 15 minutes later, another younger man showed up with a dog and started talking to the older man. I could see and hear them chatting, but they made no attempt to include us in their conversation, which I appreciated. I just wanted to enjoy a day with my son. Unfortunately, the water in the pond was incredibly low and murky, and I could tell we were not going to have any luck. So I told my son to pack up, and we would try another spot on the other side of the lake. As we were packing up our gear, the younger men called out, "Sorry, my dog," and I ran you off. I replied that it was no problem, and we were simply moving to a better fishing spot. He then started saying how nice it was to see a mom taking her kid fishing, mentioning how that is not something you see very often. I get comments like this a lot, so I was used to it. We had a short conversation as I continued packing, and then I moved toward the driver's side door, ready to leave. Before I could leave, the younger man started another conversation, this time asking me how old I thought he was. This felt strange, but being polite, I answered. I told him I was not good at guessing ages, but maybe 25. He told me he was 38, and that I was too kind. I laughed it off, saying something like I work with teenagers, so they always guess I am much older just to be mean. He then asked where I worked, and I foolishly told him the city. It turned out he lived there too, and he started going on about how he got a free apartment on a certain street after his baby mama kicked him out of their house. I assumed he was talking about some kind of government assistance program, but it felt like a strange thing to share. By this point, I was standing by the car door with my hand on the handle, and my son was already in the back seat. The man was not taking the hit and began ranting about how awful his baby mama was and how women were supposed to be submissive, quiet, and obedient. He even said, "It is cool that you can bait a hook or whatever, but you are still a woman." Alarm bells were ringing in my head. He had gone from complimenting me for taking my son fishing to criticizing me for the same thing. His attitude shifted from overly friendly to agitated and sexist. I should have just gotten in the car and left. But like many women, I have been conditioned to be polite even when uncomfortable. Instead, I made comments to show him I was not the meek, submissive woman he seemed to want. I am a tattooed woman with piercings, so I do not exactly fit the image of a quiet housewife. I was hoping to make him as uncomfortable as he made me, in the hopes he would leave me alone. After he said women should not be loud or opinionated, I told him, "Oh, you would not like me at all." He tried to backtrack, saying, "I mean, it is okay to be loud, but just do not try that with your man, you know." I reply, "My man does not tell me anything. I do what I want." This back and forth continued for a while until he finally shook his head and said, "I just do not understand what kind of woman would act like that." I simply reply, "A strong one." As soon as I said that, the older gentleman on the bank yelled, "Yeah, say that again, honey." This distracted the creep long enough for me to hop in the car and lock the doors. Despite locking the doors, I still did not feel safe. Only 2 of my car doors had functioning locks, but thankfully they were the 2 on his side. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Nothing. My car would not start. Of all the times for it to act up, it chose now. Panic set in. As I kept trying to start the car, I saw the man out of the corner of my eye. He had noticed my car trouble and was trying to get my attention. He took a few steps toward my car, but just then the engine roared to life, and I sped out of there. Only after I was safely away did I allow myself to break down and have a long talk with my son about what had just happened. To the older gentleman who noticed my discomfort and stepped in. "I would gladly meet you again any day." To the younger, misogynistic creep, I do not know if I was actually in danger, but my gut told me I was. "Let's never meet again." Oh, And to my dad, I have a new deal for you. I am never going to that lake alone again, no matter what time of day it is. I grew up in a small, rural town where nothing much ever happened. It was the kind of place where people felt comfortable leaving their doors unlocked, and our closest neighbors were miles away. My family also had an old, dramatic cat named Tag, who we all loved despite his quirks. One summer night, when I was around 9 or 10, Tag started acting strange. He usually slept curled up next to me until I fell asleep, then wandered the house doing whatever cats do at night. Occasionally he'd try to wake me up if his food bowl wasn't up to his standards, but most of the time he'd give up if I ignored him. But that night was different. It was around 2 a.m. and Tag was banging against my parents' bedroom door, meowing loudly enough to wake everyone. Our bedroom doors were next to each other, so I called for him to come back to bed, but he was having none of it. He just kept meowing, frantic and loud. My mom, annoyed, finally got up to check on him. She headed down to the kitchen, with Tag on her heels, still yowling like something was wrong. After a few minutes, she came back upstairs with him, clearly irritated. She told me his food bowl was full and the kitchen door was shut, though the screen door had been left open. Thinking that was what Tag wanted, she shut the kitchen door and returned to bed, firmly closing her bedroom door behind her so Tag couldn't come back in. I tried to calm Tag down, offering him treats from my room, but he was still fixated on getting back out. Frustrated, I opened my door, and he bolted down the stairs, back to the kitchen. That's when I heard something odd. It sounded like a door slamming. I brushed it off, thinking it was one of my older siblings moving around. Someone was always up late watching TV or grabbing a snack. Finally, Tag came back into my room, but instead of curling up next to me like he usually did, he sat at the foot of my bed, staring at the door, his eyes wide and alert. I eventually fell back asleep, but the next morning, the house was buzzing with commotion. I went downstairs and found my parents on the phone with the police. My mom had discovered that her rings, which she kept in a little dish by the kitchen sink, were missing. She always took them off before doing the dishes at night, but when she went to grab them that morning, the dish was empty. Things got worse when my dad went outside to meet the deputy the sheriff had sent. Our ATV, which was usually parked out back, was gone, along with the key that had been on the hook in the kitchen. Someone had been inside our house while we were all sleeping. As the police asked my parents if they had any idea when it might have happened, my mom started piecing things together. She turned to my brother, who was home from college for the summer, and asked him what time he'd gone to bed. He said he went to his room in the basement around 10 or 11. She asked why he had left the kitchen door open and why he hadn't gone to bed. When she told him to, my brother's face went pale. He said he'd never been upstairs after dinner. He had been in the basement all night, watching a movie in the basement living room before going to bed in his own room. That's when it hit my mom. Whoever had broken into our house had been there when she went to the kitchen. They had probably hidden on the couch in the living room when she came down to check on Tag. She had unknowingly walked right past the intruder. The deputy believed that whoever was likely knew our family's habits, someone familiar with our home and routines. They hadn't counted on Tag raising a fuss, and they probably left in a hurry, scared the cat might wake the entire house. We were never able to find out who it was. No one was ever caught, and the ATV and my mom's rings were never recovered. To this day, it's unsettling to think that the person who broke in might have been someone we knew, a friend or a neighbor. It's been over 20 years since that night, but I'll always be grateful for Tag. Without him, we might not have even known someone had been inside until much later. Who knows what else could have happened? Thank God for our cat. It all started one random evening, about 4 months ago. I was 19 at the time, heading home from university after a long day of classes. Normally, I carried my keys, but I'd recently lost them, and my mom hadn't bothered to get me a replacement. To get inside, I would knock on the door, and my younger brother, locked inside by my mom as well, would let me in that day. After being locked out, I asked my brother to pass me my charger and called my aunt to see if I could hang out at her workplace. Waiting, she agreed and even offered to pay for an Uber. I booked the ride, but instead of picking me up directly at my home, the Uber driver stopped across the street. No big deal, right? But when I saw the driver, something didn't sit right with me. I dismissed it as paranoia, which I often felt when getting into taxis or Ubers. We headed toward my aunt's place. Everything seemed fine at first until we reached her area, and the driver kept going. I asked him why, and he claimed he was just following the GPS, but when I asked to see the GPS, he refused. It was then I realized something was off, but with no sense of direction, I had no idea where he was taking me. We passed by a fountain I recognized from when my mom drove to my uncle's place, but that was much further than where I was supposed to be. He drove through an area with empty and even under construction houses before stopping on a hill that looked like the end of civilization. Then he turned off the car. I panicked. Just then my aunt called and asked where I was. My heart sank. I had no idea where I was, and the driver was just staring at me. I asked him, "Where did you take me?" His cold response was, "I wouldn't know what to tell you, kid." That was enough. I grabbed my backpack, jumped out of the car, and bolted. I didn't even put my backpack on my back. I held it in my hand, terrified that he might try to grab it and pull me back. I needed a place to hide. I saw a barren area with concrete walls and a bar gate. There was just enough space under the gate for me to crawl in. I tossed my backpack under and squeezed in after it, hiding behind an electric control box. My aunt stayed on the phone with me the whole time, while she and my uncle tried to track my location through WhatsApp. Since I didn't know where I was, I crouched there for nearly 2 hours as the driver kept circling the area in his car. I was trapped, hiding among spiders and old honeycombs, battling both my fear of spiders and my overwhelming panic. Eventually, the driver seemed to give up, and my uncle arrived in his truck, honking to let me know he was nearby. I finally heard him and made my way out of hiding. For a while, I thought maybe I had just overreacted. But when I checked the Uber app, it said I had already paid and even reached my destination. I knew then that I hadn't misunderstood the situation at all. I didn't tell my mom right away. She tends to overreact, and I didn't want her to freak out. I only told her when she came to pick me up. Since then, she finally put credit on my phone and got me that new key. In retrospect, I'm still shocked at how calm I stayed through the ordeal. My family often jokes about how I was able to keep my cool, but deep down, I know how easily this could have ended in disaster. Every time I hear about another girl going missing, I think, that could have been me. To this day, I avoid Ubers, and wherever that driver is, I hope to never cross paths with him again. This story takes me back almost 20 years to when I was 23 and working as a travel writer. I was writing for a budget travel guidebook series, mostly covering Central and Eastern Europe. Depending on the project, I could be on the road for weeks or even months at a time, traveling alone through unfamiliar places. While I'd encountered a few hiccups here and there, most of my travels were positive. At the time, I was making my way from Sarajevo to the Czech Republic after wrapping up some work in the former Yugoslavia. It was a long journey, so I broke it up into a few stops. Zagreb first, then Budapest. It was late January, bitterly cold, and there was at least 7 inches of snow on the ground. I'd been sick with the flu for days and was still feeling its effects when I left Zagreb late one afternoon, hoping to arrive in Budapest by 10 p.m. After buying my ticket at the Zagreb train station, I boarded the train and settled into a compartment by myself. The train wasn't crowded, and I spread out a little, trying to make myself comfortable for the long ride ahead. The first few hours were uneventful. I worked on some guidebook notes, scribbled in my journal, and tried to shake off my exhaustion. But as we crossed into Hungary, things took a turn. I heard them before I saw them, a group of teenage boys, loud and rowdy, running through the train car, banging on compartment doors and shouting to each other. I didn't pay them much attention at first, just kept my head down, hoping they'd lose interest and move on. But their noise grew louder, and soon enough I realized they were standing outside my compartment. Peering in, there were 5 of them, maybe more, and they were pressing their faces against the window, shouting at me. "Girl, girl," they taunted. "Come have fun." I glanced up, gave them a quick frown, and went back to my writing. Ignoring them seemed like the best option, but it only made them bolder. They started opening my compartment door just enough to mess with me, sliding it open, stepping inside, and then shutting it again. Their shouts went from annoying to threatening. "We're gonna fuck tonight," one of them yelled. Another added, "You fuck us all." They started laughing and making obscene gestures toward me. Though their language wasn't all English, I understood enough to feel the weight of their intentions. I was starting to panic. My compartment was small, and there was no way out. They blocked the door, and if I tried to leave, I'd have to walk right through them. Then one of the boys pulled out a pocket knife. He ran the blade across his tongue and pointed it at me, grinning. His friend laughed and made crude gestures. I felt my heart race, and fear settled deep in my gut. I didn't know if they were just trying to scare me or if they actually meant to do something worse. All I had for defense was a butter knife and a fingernail file in my day pack. Hardly useful weapons. My mind was racing. Should I scream? Would anyone even hear me? There hadn't been a conductor in hours, and I hadn't seen any other passengers nearby. Just as one of the boys stepped fully into my compartment, knife in hand, a voice boomed from the corridor. It was a middle-aged man, shouting angrily in a language I didn't understand. The boys froze, then scrambled out of my compartment and ran down the aisle, leaving behind the knife. I watched as the man in blue, who I assumed was a train worker, chased after them. The train came to a sudden stop, throwing me off balance. I looked out the window, nothing but blackness and snow as far as I could see. After a few minutes, the train resumed its journey, and the boys didn't return. I started to relax, but then the man who'd scared them off came back to my compartment. He was a conductor, English. He asked. I nodded, trying to calm myself down. I made them leave. "They're gone," he said, and I thanked him, grateful for his help. He sat down across from me, his presence bringing some much-needed comfort. "It's okay," he said again. "Gone?" I smiled weakly. "Thank you." I was scared, I admitted. He nodded. then leaned forward, his expression changing. "You need the fee." I was confused. "Oh, I have a ticket to Budapest," I said. Showing it to him, he glanced at it, then shrugged. "Yes, but there is a fee for Hungary. You didn't pay." I'd taken this route before and had never heard of any extra fees. Suspicion started to creep in. "How much?" I asked. He quoted me an amount that was more than I'd paid for the actual train ticket. I knew right then he was scamming me. But when I hesitated, he added, "If you don't pay, you have to leave now." I looked out the window again at the freezing black night and deep snow. I had no choice. I didn't have much cash, only about $30 and a mix of different currencies. I showed him what I had. He shrugged again. "I'll take it," he said, stuffing the money into his pocket and leaving without another word. I sat there in disbelief. The adrenaline from the encounter with the boys and the conductor's scam left me feeling shaky and nauseous. I grabbed my day pack and made my way to the bathroom, passing through the empty compartments on the way. There had been no other passengers after all. I was alone the entire time. In the tiny bathroom, I broke down. I cried until I felt like I had no more tears left, and then I threw up in the metal sink. That was a train ride I'll never forget. I never want to see those boys or anyone like them again. And as for the conductor, I hope I never cross paths with him either. It was winter, dark and cold, when this event happened. I was 20 at the time, heading home after giving lessons to my little cousins at my aunt's house. It was around 6 p.m., and I was tired from the long day. I remember waiting for the train, not really paying much attention to the direction it was going, just eager to sit down and get home once the train arrived. It was packed, and I stood for a while until a seat became available. I sat down with a sigh of relief, which caught the attention of the person sitting next to me. Embarrassed, I kept my head down and focused on my phone, not really paying attention to those around me. However, I did notice a man sitting across from me, staring at me intensely. At the time, I was too tired to care, so I just continued watching my show on my phone. The train eventually came to a stop, and the driver announced that it was the last stop. With my headphones on, I didn't hear the full message, but I assumed I just needed to stay on the train, and it would head back on the same line after a brief pause. As everyone else left, I moved to a quieter part of the train, choosing a seat by the window, far from anyone else. But just as the train was about to start again, I saw the same man from earlier walk toward me. Despite the abundance of empty seats, he sat directly across from me. Something about that felt off, but I brushed it aside, still glued to my phone. As the train moved, I noticed something strange. The stations we were passing were the ones I had already passed. I realized the train was going back toward my aunt's house, not toward my home. I felt foolish for not paying attention earlier, and I laughed to myself. I glanced up at the man, thinking maybe he'd made the same mistake. But instead of smiling back, he looked angry. That's when I felt a chill run through me. Something wasn't right. My instincts kicked in, and I realized I was in a dangerous situation. I had two options: get off at the next station and switch trains, or stay on and see what he would do. My gut told me to stay on the train, and so I did. Station after station passed, and the man didn't get off. Instead, he kept staring at me, growing angrier with each stop. His eyes were dark between me and the windows, as if he were waiting for me to leave. Then something even stranger happened. He started lightly bumping my leg with his, even though the train was nearly empty. Each time I moved, he adjusted to keep touching me. I was terrified. I tried to keep my cool, But when I looked directly at him, I saw his face twisted into a smile that sent shivers down my spine. I knew then that I had to get away from him. At the next station, I jumped out of my seat and exited the train, but he followed me. Panic set in. I couldn't lead him back to my home. My neighborhood was secluded, and there would be no one to help me if things got worse. I needed to lose him. Thinking quickly, I stayed close to the train doors, pretending everything was normal. As soon as I heard the sound of the doors closing, I jumped back inside the train at the last second. The doors shut before he could follow, and I saw his face twist in rage. He stared at me through the glass, his eyes full of fury, as if he wanted to break through the window and get to me. As the train pulled away from the station, he stood there staring until I was out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew I was finally safe. I stayed on the train for a few more stops before switching to the correct line and heading home. I ran all the way from the station, looking over my shoulder the entire time, afraid he might somehow find me again. Only when I was back in my room did I fully process what had happened. That night changed me. I had always been carefree when taking the train or subway, but from that moment on, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially when traveling at night. So to the man on the train, let's never meet again. This might not be the scariest story you've read here, but it's definitely one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. A few years ago, when I was about 20, I went on a road trip with a close friend and his family. We were heading to a concert in a neighboring country, but the plan was to stop along the way and sleep overnight in their camper. It was a casual, laid-back trip, and we hadn't even crossed the border when we pulled into a campsite for the night. The campsite was family-friendly, quiet, and felt safe. None of us had any reason to feel on edge, and I certainly didn't that evening. Around 11 p.m., while my friend and his family were winding down and getting ready for bed, I decided to step out and get some fresh air. The camper was parked near the beach, and I figured I'd take a quick walk down to the shore to relax and clear my head before calling it a night. On my way down, I passed a small beach shack. It seemed like nothing at the time, just a part of the landscape, but I'd remember it later. I stood by the water, letting the waves wash over my feet, completely absorbed in the calmness of the night. It was peaceful, with only the sound of the ocean and the moonlight shimmering on the water. As I enjoyed the moment, I noticed the silhouette of a man further down the beach. It didn't bother me at the time after all. We were in a public area for campers, so I didn't think much of it. Eventually, I decided it was time to head back. It was dark, but I've never been easily scared, and besides, the campsite was nearby. Still, as a woman, I've learned to stay on guard after dark. However, that night I felt safe. We were so close to the camper, and the area felt familiar and secure. As I walked back, I noticed that the man's silhouette was gone, which didn't worry me at first. But then, as I approached the beach shack, something caught my eye. I could see a figure trying to hide behind it, like they were deliberately avoiding being seen. My heart jumped into my throat, and my sense of calm evaporated. Immediately, I grabbed my phone and called a friend I knew would be awake. I made sure to talk loudly, pretending that she was on her way to meet me. My voice echoed in the quiet night, and I gave the beach shack a wide berth as I continued walking. I kept my eyes on the figure, never slowing down, and, thankfully, nothing happened. I made it back to the camper, slipped into bed, and tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. I didn't mention it to my friend or his family. I was shaken, but I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was just another camper. I didn't want to overreact or cause unnecessary worrying. The rest of the trip went smoothly, and I mostly forgot about the incident. It wasn't until about a year later, during a conversation with my friend, that I remembered the creepy encounter. I casually brought it up, laughing nervously about how I had gotten scared by someone lurking by the beach shack, but my friend's face went pale as I spoke. He paused for a moment before telling me something his brother had shared with the family months after the trip. That same night, after I had come back and gone to bed, his brother had woken up late to get a drink of water. On his way to the kitchen, he passed by the window next to his bed and saw a man standing outside, staring in. As soon as their eyes met, the man turned and left. His brother was spooked, but, like me, he didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so he kept it to himself. Hearing this sent chills down my spine. Could it have been the same man I saw hiding by the beach shack? Had he followed me back to the camper, watching from the shadows? I'll never know for sure, but the thought terrifies me. I hate to think about what might have happened if I hadn't made that phone call, or if I'd been completely alone. When I was 18, I was working at a large department store stationed in the garden center. It was 2006, and back then, life felt a bit simpler. I was friendly, a bit too friendly, as I've learned over the years. I used to strike up conversations easily, being approachable and open at chatting with anyone who crossed my path. One day, during one of my shifts, a new employee walked up to me. He seemed harmless enough, mid to late 40s, with a kind demeanor. There was nothing particularly alarming about him at first glance. We exchanged pleasantries, talked through the shift, and to me it felt like any ordinary day. For about 2 weeks we worked together, and during that time I thought he was just a nice middle-aged guy trying to fit into a new job. He seemed polite, didn't come off as weird or threatening, but as I was soon to find out, my first impression couldn't have been further from the truth. It all started when he suddenly stopped showing up for work. At first, I didn't think much of it. People come and go all the time, especially in retail. But then word got around that he had been arrested. Apparently, he had been caught putting nude photos of himself in women's pantyhose and leaving them on people's cars at a CVS nearby. I was shocked. It was hard to process how the men I had been talking to casually for days could be capable of something like that. Soon after, things took an even darker turn. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I noticed a car trailing slowly behind me. I turned around, and my heart dropped. It was him. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that maybe it was just a coincidence. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. His car would follow me, keeping a steady pace as I walked home. He'd drive by my house, sometimes as many as 4 times in a single day. It was unnerving. The realization that someone was watching me so closely began to eat away at my sense of safety. I couldn't stay at the department store any longer. The paranoia was too much. I quit and found a new job at a fast food restaurant, hoping that the change would put some distance between us. But he found me again. It didn't take long before he started coming into the restaurant. He wouldn't order anything. He'd just sit in the dining area for hours, staring at me as I worked. The way his eyes followed my every move made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that he'd lose interest if I didn't acknowledge him. But that didn't work. No matter what I did, he remained a constant, unsettling presence. This went on for nearly 2 years. 2 years of me living in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, dreading the moment I'd see his car or catch him watching me from the corner of the room. I couldn't understand why no one was doing anything about it. I had complained to the management at the restaurant several times, but they brushed it off, saying there wasn't much they could do. That all changed the day I walked into work with a copy of a newspaper article detailing his arrest. I handed it to my manager, showing them the kind of person they were allowing into the establishment. The expression on their face shifted from annoyance to shock, and they finally took action. They asked him not to return. Even though he stopped coming to the restaurant, he wasn't entirely gone from my life. I'd still see his car sometimes driving past my house. The sight of it would send a wave of terror through me. I couldn't live like that anymore. I decided to move, leaving behind the neighborhood and the job in hopes that I could finally escape his watchful eye. For a while it worked. I didn't see him. I started to feel a bit more at ease, thinking that maybe he had finally given up and moved on. But then, out of nowhere, he resurfaced. I was at my new job, going about my day, when I spotted him. The second I saw his face, it was as if the world had stopped. Panic gripped me, and, without even thinking, I bolted to the back room. My heart was racing, and I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. I collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. My assistant manager found me in that state, and immediately asked what had happened. Through gasps and tears, I told her everything: the stalking, the relentless presence, the fear that had haunted me for years. She wasted no time. She called the police, and finally they intervened. He was officially put on notice and was barred from coming anywhere near me. The relief I felt was overwhelming, though it didn't erase the years of fear I had endured. It's been about 10 years since that day, and, thankfully, I haven't seen him since. But even now, after all this time, I can't forget his face. His name still lingers in the back of my mind, sending chills down my spine whenever I think of him. Some experiences stay with you, no matter how much time has passed. This was one of those experiences. His presence may be gone, but the fear, the anxiety, the sense of being watched, it's something I'll carry with me forever. This is a true story, and every time I tell it, it captures the attention of everyone in the room. I'm not sure why I haven't shared it here before, but after reflecting with a friend, I decided it was finally time. In the summer of 2020, my friends Alex, Violet, and I decided to take a much-needed vacation in the mountains. Cabin fever from the COVID lockdown had hit us hard, and we were desperate to get out of the house. We chose a mountainous state and planned a trip that involved camping and hiking in a few different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a secluded cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had once stayed in a fire tower, but the only thing we could find was a cabin next to one. It was cheap, clean, and, most importantly, secluded. We were excited about a night where we could be as loud as we wanted, so we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we got the idea to drop acid during our stay at the cabin. Violet even bought a full sheet of it in preparation. However, as we were driving toward the cabin, I had this strange, gnawing feeling in my stomach. Something inside me told me it wasn't the right night for us to trip. I voiced my concern to Alex and Violet was furious. We got into a huge argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that it wasn't a good idea. Eventually, Violet calmed down, and we continued on our way. The cabin was located about 30 minutes from the nearest town. It was perched at the top of a mountain, and the road leading up was narrow and winding, with no pull-offs or other campsites along the way. As we made our way up, we held our breath with every sharp turn. Finally, we reached the top and settled into the cabin. We started a fire outside to keep warm as dusk fell, enjoying the quiet solitude. At around dusk, we heard the sound of an engine approaching, followed by the glow of headlights. A side-by-side pulled up, and we saw 3 kids in it. They smiled and waved before climbing the fire tower and leaving shortly after. We knew there might be occasional visitors to the fire tower, and since they seemed harmless, we didn't think much of it. After the fire died down, we headed inside the cabin, cooked some hot dogs, and tried to enjoy the evening. That's when we realized just how quiet it was. In the city, you're always surrounded by background noise, air conditioners, traffic, people, but out here, there was nothing. You could hear every rustle of the leaves, every gust of wind. The silence was so intense that even our breathing seemed loud. We were all on edge, jumping at every little sound, too spooked to talk. Eventually, I had enough of the tense atmosphere. I cracked open some wine coolers, passed them around, and pulled out a board game. Slowly, we began to relax, laughing and having the kind of fun we'd envisioned when we planned the trip. It wasn't the wild night we had expected, but it was enough to distract us from the eerie quiet. Later, each of us would recall hearing strange noises, twigs snapping, the faint sound of an engine, but none of us wanted to ruin the mood, so we ignored them, that is, until we couldn't anymore. Out of nowhere, a human hen slapped the window next to us 3 times. We screamed in unison, the panic hitting us like a freight train. Alex immediately grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and put the dispatcher on speaker before handing the phone to me. He grabbed fireplace pokers and passed them out as makeshift weapons, while Violet began frantically calling family members, saying her goodbyes. My heart raced, and I strained to hear any more movement outside, but there was only silence. Whoever had slapped that window had realized we called the police and was making a stealthy retreat. 20 minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the police arrived with dogs to search the area. They found nothing. The officers tried to reassure us, suggesting it could have been a bear, but none of us believed that for a second. Why would a bear smack the window by a bunch of screaming kids? Why would it retreat so quietly instead of charging toward the food? And why did it slap the window like a human? The officers didn't have any answers, but they did mention something unsettling. On their way up to us, they had passed a car parked at the base of the mountain, the only other sign of life they had seen. My blood ran cold when I heard that. Violet and Alex, still frazzled, didn't seem to register what the officers had said. Then, as we were packing up to leave, we noticed Violet's car was covered in handprints. The thick layer of dust from the mountain road made them stand out clearly, handprints that didn't belong to us and were on parts of the car we hadn't touched. We frantically threw our belongings into the car and followed the police down the mountain. Every bump and pothole felt like we were escaping something dark and malevolent. We made it down in record time and checked into a cheap motel that reeked of cat piss. But at that point, we didn't care. None of us could sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about that car at the base of the mountain. There was nothing else on that mountain. No campsites, no pull-offs, nothing. Whoever had slapped the window had parked far down the road and hiked up the rest of the way in silence, deliberately avoiding being seen. This wasn't a prank. It was planned. They wanted to scare us, or worse. To this day, I don't know what the person on the mountain wanted from us. Was it a joke, or was it the start of something much more sinister? I'll never know, and honestly, I don't want to meet Midnight Stranger. A couple of years before the pandemic, my friend Mary introduced me to a guy named Joe. He wasn't my type, but Mary's the kind of person who turns into a matchmaker when she's in a relationship. To make her happy, I agreed to go on a couple of dates with him. Our first meetup was a group date with Mary, her boyfriend, Tim, and another couple. Joe seemed all right at first, friendly, cracked a few jokes, and we had decent conversation. By the end of the night, he asked if we could meet up again, and I agreed. Later, I told Mary about it, and she was overjoyed. But Tim, who was training to be a doctor and had a knack for reading people, didn't seem so thrilled. Something's off about Joe, he told me. I had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right, too, but there was nothing specific I could put my finger on. I brushed it off, but Tim warned me to be careful. For a couple of weeks, Joe and I texted, and that's when his weirdness really began to show. He had low self-esteem and constantly fished for reassurance. It was subtle at first, but quickly became toxic. His messages went from mildly self-deprecating to manipulative, always seeking attention in unsettling ways. I was already losing interest. But Mary was so invested in the idea of Joe and me hitting it off that I decided to give him one more chance. I invited him to an event with my hobby club, thinking it'd be safe with lots of people around. The evening went okay, nothing weird happened, and we ended the night on neutral terms. I thought I could ease him into a platonic relationship and move on. A few weeks later, Joe called me in the middle of the night, claiming he was going to commit suicide. Panicked, I stayed on the phone with him all night, talking him down. I was exhausted, but I couldn't just hang up, afraid that he might actually hurt himself. I kept him calm until sunrise, and just when I thought things were okay, he said, "That was the best night of my life," and hung up. Sounding elated, I was stunned. I realized then that he'd manipulated the entire situation to get my attention. That was the final straw. I told Mary about it, and she was horrified. She apologized profusely and warned me to call the cops if Joe ever showed up at my house. Thankfully, I hadn't given him my address, but I still felt uneasy about how things ended. Not long after, I started getting late-night calls from a private number. The caller never spoke, just breathed heavily. I blocked each number, but Joe found ways to get around it. He started using a private number, which meant I couldn't block him anymore. The creepy calls went on for over a year, and I had to pick up each one, thinking it might be an emergency from a family member, but every time it was just Joe. One night, at around 3 a.m., I got another call. Staring at the phone, I suddenly had an idea. I have a deep voice for a woman, and back in high school, my dad used to mistake me for my brother, John, when I answered the phone half away. John had passed away a few years ago, and I hadn't heard his voice in a long time, but I knew I could mimic it. When I answered, I dropped my voice as low as I could and said hello in my best John impression. Silence, no creepy breathing, just dead air. I repeated hello, and after a brief pause, Joe hung up. He had always been the one to hang on until I ended the call, but this time he bailed. It was the first moment of relief I'd felt in ages. It's been over a year now, and the calls have stopped. I think Joe must believe I've changed my number or moved on. Maybe hearing what he thought was another guy's voice threw him off enough to give up. In a strange way, it felt like my brother had come back, even if just for a moment, to protect me. I know John would have been proud. I still worry sometimes. Whenever I see a suspicious car or hear strange noises outside, I wonder if Joe is lurking nearby. I've heard from mutual friends that he's told people some disturbing lies about me, including claiming we slept together. which never happened. Worse, Joe allegedly told someone he wants to kill me. Thankfully, Mary's friend told him I've moved to a different city, and he seems to believe it. When I finish my studies, I plan to move across the country. Until then, I keep my distance, head down, and hope Joe stays far away. Mary has sworn off matchmaking for good after all this, which is one small silver lining dot. As for Joe, let's hope we never meet again. The following events took place over the course of a year, and it took me a long time to link them all together. I'm 31 now, but this all happened when I was around 18 to 20 years old. At the time, I worked as a support worker in the UK, helping adults with learning disabilities and health issues in their homes and out in the community. The job involved long hours, sleepovers, and waking nights. The people I supported were very active, so I spent a lot of time out and about with them, often using public transportation. The building I work in was across from a nursing home, and at 10 p.m. every night, a car would park across the street and shine its high beams into our window. It blinded anyone inside who happened to be looking out, but it was so low on the list of concerns that we just brushed it off. This went on for months, but then a colleague pointed out that it only happened when I was working. We laughed about it, saying I must have a fancy man picking me up, but I shrugged it off. The people I supported started making comments about a man watching me. At first, it was just one client, but eventually all of them began mentioning it. They had limited communication skills, but they consistently said it was the same man. They couldn't describe him fully, but they gave vague details that made it clear someone was indeed watching me. The other staff found it odd that the clients only made these comments when I was around, but again, I dismissed it. Then things escalated. One winter evening, I had worked late and was heading home after grabbing some food and a book from the city center. As I was walking down to the metro station, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a man who I assumed was just asking for directions. I tried to brush him off, but he followed me to the ticket barrier, bought a ticket, and followed me onto the platform. He sat next to me, despite there being plenty of empty seats. He started rambling about how he had seen me around with different men and how he just wanted to look after me because I kept ignoring him. He described my daily commute, my work schedule, and even my changing hair colors. It became clear that he had been watching me for a long time, but I was too tired and freaked out to fully process it at the time. I tried to lose him by changing metro lines several times, and eventually I did. I made it home safely, but told my manager about the incident the next day. She gave me a personal alarm, but I didn't connect it to the other strange things that had been happening, so I just let it go. The final event happened when I wasn't at work. Two of my co-workers were sorting out medication upstairs when they came down to find a man sitting at the dining table. The people we supported were all in their rooms, so downstairs should have been empty. This man matched the description of my stalker. Somehow, he had bypassed multiple locked and alarm doors to get inside. He didn't respond to any of their questions and eventually just got up and left. We never found out how he got in, and no action was taken by the company. They assumed he was an agency worker who had gone to the wrong house, but he never showed ID when asked. After that, I was offered a new job in a different city, and I left the area for about 5 years. I never saw the man again, and now I live back in the same vicinity, but in a different area with a new name through marriage. Although I can't definitively prove all these events were connected, the description of the man was consistent throughout. To this day, I still avoid public transport if I'm out late and rely on taxis instead. The whole experience left me shaken and hyper-aware of how vulnerable I had been. Even now, I still feel uneasy when I think about it. When I was 17, working as a delivery driver for an old pizza shop in a small suburban town, I experienced one of the most terrifying nights of my life. This happened 3 years ago, and I still can't shake the feeling of unease when I think about it. For some background, the pizza shop had been around for about 20 years, mostly catering to the blue-collar workers who live just outside of town. The town itself had gone through a lot of gentrification with wealthier folks moving in, but the pizza shop remained one of the few businesses that still served the older crowd. It was around 9 p.m. when a call came in for 2 pizzas and a 2-liter soda. Since I was the only driver on shift, I had to take the delivery. The address was about 10 minutes away, but once I got closer, I realized the house was far off the main road, down a long gravel driveway. The driveway was rough, and my car was struggling to make it up, which didn't help the knot of anxiety building in my stomach. The house itself looked nice enough, sitting on a large property surrounded by 2 barns and fields of tall, swaying wheat. But something about the isolation, being out there on a lonely farm, made my nerves spike. I've always found farms unsettling, and that night, standing there all alone, my anxiety flared up like never before. I had no idea where the customer wanted me to deliver the food, so I called the number on the order. After a long, eerie silence, the man finally answered. His voice was deep and raspy, like he had been smoking for decades, and he told me to meet him at his truck parked near the far barn. My stomach dropped. Every worst-case scenario I could think of flooded my mind. Was this guy going to rob me, kidnap me, kill me? My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to drive farther onto his property. As I rounded a large storage silo, I spotted his F-150 truck with him sitting inside. Instead of getting out of my car, I called him again to ask how he wanted to handle the delivery. In that same raspy voice, he instructed me to put the food in the bed of his truck. Since he had already paid with a credit card, I figured it would be over quickly. I did as he asked, and then approached the passenger side window for him to sign the receipt. He was a big guy, probably in his mid-40s, heavy-set, with a scraggly black beard and a trucker hat. I'm a pretty skinny guy, so standing there in front of him, in the middle of nowhere, I felt completely vulnerable. I realized I had forgotten to bring a pen, so I asked if he had one. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unblinking. Then, in a low, threatening tone, he pointed to the back of his truck and said, "If you ask me for a tip, I'll shove this tip down your fucking throat." I looked where he was pointing and saw a double-barrel shotgun lying in the back of the truck. I froze. My brain was struggling to process the fact that this man had just threatened to kill me. This was the second time something like this had happened that night. Earlier, I had been threatened by another customer for accidentally messing up an address. That guy had come out of his house wearing a cowboy hat and a WWE belt, telling me he had the right to shoot trespassers. What were the odds that 2 people would threaten my life in the same shift? All I could manage to say was, "Okay," and I quickly got back into my car. I floored it, racing back down that gravel driveway so fast that my car was bouncing around uncontrollably. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that place. I sped all the way back to the pizza shop, where I told my coworkers what had happened, but no one took me seriously. They thought I was exaggerating or making a joke. I tried to forget about the incident, and for the most part I did. But about a year later, I was working the lunch shift when the same man called in another order. I refused to take it, telling my manager about what had happened before. Unfortunately, it was during the height of the pandemic, and the shop was barely hanging on, so they forced me to make the delivery dot. It was around 1 or 2 p.m. on a Sunday, so at least I didn't have to worry about the darkness. When I arrived at the house, the man was waiting for me on the porch. To my surprise, he recognized me immediately and started apologizing for what had happened. He explained that he was going through a tough divorce at the time and wasn't handling his emotions well. I didn't really care about his excuses. I just wanted to drop off the food and get out of there. Before I left, he handed me $60 as a tip, saying it was to make up for his behavior, even though he apologized. I'll never forget how terrified I was that night. I hope I never have to deliver to that farm again. To the man on the farm, let's never meet again. I was about 25 or 26 when this happened, and I worked as a full-time researcher at university. I am not a professor or anything, but given my age and appearance, I could easily be mistaken for just another student walking around campus. On certain days, I liked spending my lunch outside when the weather was nice, enjoying the break from my lab work. One day, as I was sitting on a bench, a male student approached me and asked if he could sit next to me. Even though I am a shy and reserved person who prefers to be alone, I felt it would be rude to decline, so I said sure. He made small talk, and I tried to keep the conversation polite but distant. Then something strange happened. He mentioned he had seen me coming and going from my departmental building. I had never seen him before, but I brushed off the comment. He asked if I was a student there, to which I clarified that I worked at the university. He mentioned he was an engineering student and then asked me out for coffee. I apologized and told him I had a boyfriend, and he left. I thought that would be the end of it. A week or two later, I was outside during lunch again, sitting on a different bench, when the same guy showed up and asked to sit with me again. My anxiety spiked. I felt awkward, knowing I would have to turn him down once more if he asked me out. Sure enough, he did again. I reminded him that I had a boyfriend, and he left. This encounter made me uneasy, but I was not too alarmed at that point. A few days later, something even more unsettling occurred. I had finished work and was walking to my car, which I had parked about 10 minutes away from campus to avoid paying for an expensive parking pass. My route took me down some quiet residential streets, and as I walked, I noticed someone was following me on the other side of the road. I kept him in my peripheral vision and avoided turning around to confront him. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence. However, when I took a few turns, he followed. At that point, I realized he was intentionally keeping pace with me. I sped up, hoping to shake him off. But as I did, he also quickened his steps. Panic surged through me. I broke into a full sprint as I approached a busier street, praying I could cross before he caught up. Thankfully, traffic cleared just in time for me to cross. As I reached the other side, I turned around to see who was following me. It was him, the same guy from before. I was furious and scared, so I yelled at him to stop following me. He called back, asking if he could talk to me, but I ignored him and continued rushing to my car. I managed to get in and drive away safely, but the incident shook me to my core. When I got home, I broke down in tears. I had been fortunate nothing worse happened, but the experience left me anxious and fearful, especially when walking alone. After that, I started walking with a coworker to our cars, and I even changed my parking location for a while. Weeks passed, and I had not seen him around campus, which gave me some relief. I started spending my lunch breaks indoors, avoiding going outside. But one day, while standing in line at the crowded student center food court, I heard someone call out. I looked up, and there he was, waving at me, trying to make his way through the crowd. Panic surged through me again, and I yelled at him to leave me alone. People around us turned to stare, and his face dropped. He slinked away into the crowd, and I never saw him again. That was about 6 years ago. I still work at the university, and I am relieved that I never encountered him after that day in the food court. I did not know his name, so I was unable to report him to campus authorities. I just hope he never harassed anyone else the way he did with me. In my late teens and early 20s, I became friends with a girl named Lucy. She was incredibly lonely, dealing with neglect from her father and emotional abuse from her mother. To cope with this void in her life, she sought out attention from strange men online and met them in person. Often after chatting for only a few days, her constant need for validation made her relationships unpredictable and short-lived. Lucy and I had a complicated friendship. There were times when I found her annoying, but I also felt sorry for her because of how isolated she was. We had a small group of friends, and when we all hung out, she was happier, almost desperate to maintain the friendships she had. But as time went on, Lucy started dating a guy named Trevor, and everything began to change. Trevor was unlike anyone Lucy had ever dated. From the moment we met him, we could all tell something was off. He barely spoke, wouldn't make eye contact, and gave Lucy disdainful looks. Afterward, Lucy told me that Trevor didn't like me, which was strange because I had never given him any reason to. I tried to distance myself from them, but Lucy would still try to see me behind Trevor's back, hiding our friendship from him. Then one day, Lucy invited me to her house. After a short time together, she received a phone call, and unlike before, she walked away to take it, far enough that I couldn't hear the conversation. When she came back, something in her demeanor had changed. She told me she had to take me home. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I noticed we weren't heading toward my house, my alarm bells went off. "Where are we going?" I asked. She just smirked but didn't respond. My unease grew. "Seriously, where are you taking me?" I asked again, but she just kept driving. Finally, with an unsettling grin, she said, "Trevor wants to talk to you." Panic surged through me. Why would Trevor, the guy who clearly despised me, want to talk to me? What was the real plan here? I demanded that she stop the car, but she just kept saying it was fine. I knew in that moment I had to get out Dot as soon as she stopped at a red light. I grabbed her bus pass from the back seat, unlocked the door, and bolted. I had no idea where I was, but I wasn't about to find out what Trevor had in store for me. Lucy sped off in anger, and I immediately cut all ties with her, blocking her number and warning our group of friends about her. That was the last time I ever spoke to Lucy, and frankly, I'm glad I got out when I did. This happened over 20 years ago, when I was around 16. At the time, I lived in a rough neighborhood in a housing project with my family. I was the oldest of 6 kids, and my youngest sister was only 5 years old. Our living situation wasn't ideal, but we made do. Despite the sketchy neighborhood, we tried to keep things normal. We had this neighbor who was always friendly, but frequently had some shady people hanging around, especially men. I never liked being outside when they were around, but sometimes you don't have a choice. One day, the new guys started showing up at her house regularly. They were always outside, either smoking or just hanging out on her porch. The way they stared at me every time I went outside gave me chills. It was like they were waiting for something. Occasionally, they tried to make conversation or ask me to come over. Sometimes, when my parents weren't home, they'd even wander into our yard and talk to me. They'd ask things like, "Do you have a boyfriend?" or "Do you want some beer or weed?" I was this straight-laced Mormon girl, so I always declined and excused myself, saying I needed to go back inside. They were probably around 30 years old, but they made me feel so uncomfortable. Looking back, I see how wrong all of it was, but at the time I was raised to be polite no matter what. I'd always answer kindly and try to get away without causing a scene. Soon they started coming over asking to use our phone when my parents weren't home. It wasn't uncommon. Our family had an open-door policy with the neighbors when it came to borrowing the phone. I didn't know how to say no, so I'd hand it to them through the door, keeping them on the porch. They'd sometimes try to strike up a conversation or ask if they could come inside, but I'd make up an excuse about my parents not being home. In hindsight, I realize how easily they could have pushed their way in, but back then I was so focused on being polite I didn't see the danger. One morning, I was outside early, walking our little dog on a leash like I usually did. As I stood in the yard, one of the guys came out of a house next door. He just stood there, staring at me for a few minutes before going back inside. The whole interaction felt off, but I tried to ignore it. A few minutes after I took the dog back inside, I heard a soft knock on the door. When I opened it, both of the guys were standing there. One of them, with this urgency in his voice, said, "We just saw your baby sister out by the highway. You need to come get her." My heart dropped. The thought of my little sister, who was only 5, wandering near the busy highway terrified me. I immediately rushed outside with them. I started running down the street towards the highway, and one of the guys called out, "No, we'll drive you there. We need to hurry." I was in such a panic that I took a couple of steps towards their truck before a sudden wave of dread hit me. Something wasn't right. I stopped in my tracks and said I need to go back and tell my parents first. That's when the man closest to me grabbed my arm, pulling me hard towards the truck. "We have to go now. She's going to get hit by a car," he yelled. My stomach turned, and I knew right then that this wasn't about my sister. I pulled back and screamed, "Let go of me." He let go immediately, and I ran back inside the house as fast as I could. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted to my parents' bedroom, where they were still asleep, and threw open the door. There, safe and sound, my little sister was sleeping in bed with them. I woke everyone up, still shaking from what had just happened. My dad ran outside, but by then the guys and their truck were gone. They never showed up at the neighbor's house again. It was like they vanished overnight. Looking back, I wish my parents had called the police, or at least taken it more seriously, but they just brushed it off, saying maybe the men had mistaken another child for my sister. I don't know who those guys were or what they were planning, but I'm certain they weren't just trying to help. I'll never forget that moment when I almost stepped into their truck. Something deep inside me told me to stop, and I'm so thankful I listened to that instinct. A few weeks ago, I started a new job at a petrol station. With years of experience from a previous job, I thought this would be easy, but working alone for 8 hours, especially during late shifts, turned out to be a different story. It all began during my afternoon shift, about half an hour in. When a man walked into the shop, I recognized him from the day before when he had asked for some shopping bags, which I had to turn down. He gave me uncomfortable vibes, but thankfully a colleague was there that day, and I asked them to handle the situation. My colleague told him we didn't have any bags, and he left. On this particular day, the same man walked in again. I thought, oh great, what does he want now? He came up to the desk and started chatting with me, asking for advice about his living situation. As he mentioned, he used to be homeless. I didn't feel comfortable giving advice, nor did I want to engage in a long conversation, so I just suggested he think things over. After he left, I realized I had made a mistake by telling him I would be off at 11 o'clock. As my shift continued, he returned around 9:30 p.m., this time with another man who looked suspicious, dressed in black with a hood up. The previous guy asked if we did phone pop-ups, and something in my gut told me to make him leave. I lied and said we didn't offer that service. The two men hung around outside the store for a while. When the shop was quiet again, they came back in, and the new guy kept his hands in his pockets the entire time. I immediately feared I was about to be robbed. I stayed calm, preparing to hit the panic button under the desk if they made any aggressive moves. Fortunately, they only bought a bottle of water. I felt a huge sigh of relief, thinking they might have reconsidered robbing me, possibly due to another person waiting outside. Once they left, I quickly locked the main door using the switch to prevent them from coming back in. Half an hour later, they were still hanging around outside, and a new figure appeared, another man in black with a COVID mask. He handed out masks to the other two and went around the back of the store. Realizing the back door, which I used to go out for breaks, was vulnerable, I dashed to lock it securely. I was terrified, hiding in the office while monitoring the cameras. I tried to call the police, but struggled with the automated phone menu. In the midst of my panic, a colleague called my mobile to check on me. I explained the situation and then decided to come up with a plan. I asked my colleague to stay on the phone and keep quiet while I went to check on the intruders. I told him if I said the till is slow, he should hang up and call emergency services. I approached the window where the men were knocking. I asked them what they wanted and told them the door was locked for night mode, but I could serve them through the hatch. They requested some tobacco and a lighter. I quickly grabbed their items and passed them through the hatch, keeping a close eye on them. When they left, I was overwhelmed with relief and anxiety. I burst into tears, collapsing on the floor. Having held in my fear for so long, after that night, I demanded a change to morning shifts or I would quit. The experience was too harrowing, and I knew I couldn't go through another night like that. I've been meaning to post this for a while. I wrote the first draft back in April, and it's taken months of therapy for me to even begin processing this experience. Reading through other people's stories, I noticed how many of them unfold over weeks, months, or even years. My story, however, takes place over just 12 hours, and in those 12 hours, my life was forever changed. I'd managed to block out a lot of what happened that night, but earlier this year, I was mugged. That event triggered a return of my PTSD, and with it, many of the memories I had worked so hard to forget. This is the first time I'm telling the full story, details that I haven't shared with anyone, not my partner, not my therapist, not even my parents. If you take anything away from what I'm about to share, let it be this. You do not have to be polite to everyone you meet. The setting, it was October 2018. I was 18, fresh into my first year at university in a big city in the UK. Before this, I had always lived in the countryside and, needless to say, I was not very street smart. The city was a new and overwhelming experience. Around a year before I started university, I had entered into a relationship with a guy named Jimmy, now my ex. It was my first real relationship, and at the time I thought the world of him. Unfortunately, that admiration wasn't mutual, at least not in a healthy, loving way. From the start, Jimmy was emotionally abusive, and things only got worse as time went on, but that's another story in itself. By the time of this incident, Jimmy and I had been together for almost a year. Coincidentally, we both applied to universities in the same city, and when we moved, we ended up just miles apart. Despite that, I was determined to have the full university experience and chose to live in a student block on the opposite side of the city. Jimmy, meanwhile, had his own place. One thing that complicated our relationship further was Jimmy's increasing drug use. What started as just smoking weed quickly escalated, and by the time we were at uni, he was regularly using hard drugs while still smoking weed multiple times a day. I don't think I ever saw him sober after we moved to university. We continued to see each other every few days. Not long after arriving in the city, Jimmy found a regular drug dealer, a guy named Mark, who lived a lot closer to my student accommodation than to Jimmy's. Jimmy was buying from Mark several times a week, and I'd met Mark briefly a few times. Always, when I was with Jimmy, a few weeks before the night that changed everything, Jimmy started picking up his drugs from Mark whenever he came to visit me. This meant that Mark was frequently hanging around outside my accommodation, waiting for Jimmy. On more than one occasion, Jimmy asked me to pick up the drugs from Mark for him, but I always refused. I felt uneasy around Mark and didn't like the idea of being involved in drug deals, especially since I didn't even smoke weed myself. But those refusals would only last so long. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the worst nights of my life. A T6 It was late October, and Jimmy was coming over that evening. Like he often did, he asked me to pick up some weed from Mark. Normally, I would have said no, but I was in an unusually good mood that day, feeling more confident than usual. For the first time, I agreed. Jimmy gave me Mark's number and told me to expect a message. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, Mark texted me, saying he was almost outside my building. I grabbed my jacket and headed out. There was a quieter spot outside my accommodation, with benches scattered around. I decided to sit and wait for Mark there. Behind me, the only thing was a brick wall and a small enclosed area where the bins for the building were kept. As I sat, lost in thought, I suddenly felt hands on my shoulders, unexpected, rough, and invasive. I jumped, heart racing, and twisted around to see Mark. I barely recognized him, having only met him a few times in passing, but it didn't take long for that unease to settle in. He must have been lurking by the bins, watching me without my noticing. My mind started racing. The way he touched me felt off wrong. It wasn't just a casual gesture. It had a strange, possessive energy to it. My instincts kicked in immediately, and I shifted away, putting as much space between us as I could without causing a scene. Mark sat down next to me like we were old friends, but my guard was up. He started talking a lot. His questions were relentless, deep, personal ones that made me feel more and more uncomfortable. Who was I? Where was I from? What did I do for fun? He was trying to peel back the layers of my life, and I had no intention of letting him in. I deflected every question, offering short answers, and then flipped the conversation around, asking about him instead. I hoped it would distract him, keep him from prying further into my world. That's when his tone changed. He launched into a long-winded monologue about his life, casually revealing that he had just been released from prison a few months prior. Armed robbery or something else involving violence he didn't specify, and honestly, I didn't want to know. I just nodded along, pretending to be interested, all the while wondering how I had ended up in this situation. The whole reason I was here was to pick up drugs for my boyfriend, but now I was stuck in a conversation with a man who made every fiber of my being scream to run. At 7 p.m. I've always been the kind of person who can talk to anyone, and growing up, I was taught to be polite, even when I didn't feel comfortable. So I ended up sitting outside with Mark for nearly an hour, trapped in this endless conversation while it grew darker. I kept glancing at my phone, expecting Jimmy to text me that he was on his way, but there was no response. I had to get back inside, get ready for the evening, and finally I had enough. I told Mark one had plans to meet my boyfriend soon and go clubbing afterward with friends, so I needed to go inside and get ready. Then I asked if I could just get the drugs and go. That's when things took a turn. Mark said, "Oh, well, I can't give them to you here. There's CCTV everywhere. We can go inside so I can give them to you." My stomach dropped. I had seen him hand over drugs to Jimmy right in this spot countless times before. This was total bullshit, but I didn't want to cause any drama or risk angering him. I didn't want him coming back to my apartment either, so I suggested he give me the drugs in the lobby bathroom, which was a disabled access restroom that was large and a bit more private. He agreed and followed me inside. The bathroom was spacious, and I stood as far away from him as I could. He locked the door behind us, which immediately made my skin crawl. He started fiddling with something in his pocket, and I assumed he was finally getting the drugs out. But instead, he dropped his trousers completely and started peeing in the toilet. My heart raced, and my whole body froze in shock. This guy just exposed himself in front of me, completely unbothered. But in my naive attempt to rationalize things, I told myself that maybe he was just comfortable around me because he'd seen me with Jimmy. There was no way, I thought, that he had any sexual motive. After all, he knew I was in a relationship, and we'd met a few times before. I kept my eyes shut the whole time, desperate for this nightmare to be over. When he finally flushed the toilet, I thought, okay, now he'll give me the drugs, and I can get the hell out of here. But no, instead he said, "I really want to roll myself a joint, but there's no space in here. Can I come roll it on your desk, and then I'll give you Jimmy's stuff?" I felt cornered and anxious. I asked again if he could just give me the drugs now, but he refused, saying I was being rude for not inviting him in. At this point, I was desperate to get ready for my plans later that evening. Jimmy was supposed to show up any minute, and Mark was starting to make me panic. But I knew Jimmy would be furious if I didn't come through with the drugs, and I was terrified of upsetting Mark, his favorite dealer. I kept telling myself that despite his odd behavior, Mark was harmless. After all, I'd interacted with him before, and he was just a bit creepy, right? Nothing serious would happen. I convinced myself it would all be fine. At 8 p.m., reluctantly, I let Mark into my apartment. I told him he needed to roll his joint quickly because I had to get ready. He finally handed over the drugs that Jimmy had wanted, which gave me a small sense of relief. Mark moved my belongings on my desk to make space and began the painstaking process of rolling his joint. I had seen Jimmy roll a joint 100 times, and it usually took just a minute or two. But Mark's method was excruciatingly slow. Every minute felt like an hour. He tried to engage me in conversation again, but I was done with small talk. My responses were short and curt. Mark finally finished rolling, but then he said, "Well, I can't smoke this outside. Is it cool if I just stay here and smoke it? It'll only take 5 minutes." I told him no, emphasizing once again that I needed to get ready. His reply was unnerving. "It's okay. You can get ready with me here." I was beyond frustrated. I messaged Jimmy again, urging him to hurry. Mark asked again if he could stay and smoke. At this point, I was so desperate to get rid of him that I reluctantly agreed. "Okay, sure, but be quick." I left him sitting at my desk and went into the shared kitchen. My two flatmates weren't home, so the apartment was quiet. I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would help me unwind from the stressful situation. After a few sips, I returned to my room. Mark was still talking, but I was no longer listening. I chugged my wine, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread, deciding that if Mark was going to be slow, I might as well use the time to get ready. I told him that he could leave on his own once he finished smoking. I grabbed some clothes and headed into the bathroom for a shower, hoping that when I emerged, Mark would be gone. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one dragging the tension with it, and I was left with a growing sense of unease as I tried to stay focused on my routine. At 9 p.m., a minute or so into my shower, I heard faint footsteps outside the door. My heart sank as I saw the door handle slowly turn. Thankfully, I had locked the door. Mark started banging on it. I turned off the shower and said, "Hi," through the door. He shouted back, asking to be let in because he needed to pee again. I firmly said no and quickly dried and dressed, relieved that I had taken my clothes into the bathroom with me. I realized that Mark wasn't planning on leaving until I did. I rushed through my makeup and messaged my friends to let them know I'd be arriving earlier than planned. Still no response from Jimmy, so I told him I was heading out early and not to come over. I told Mark that I was leaving and insisted that he needed to come downstairs with me. He remained at my desk, ignoring me and instead asking if he could stay in my room while I was out, claiming he was tired and wanted a nap. After much insisting, he reluctantly agreed to leave with me. I ordered an Uber to my friend's place, ensuring that Mark couldn't follow me on foot. When we got outside, my Uber was just about to arrive. Mark stood with me, peering over my shoulder at my phone. The Uber pulled up, and as I was about to get in, Mark walked around the car and got in on the other side. Stunned, I laughed nervously and told the Uber driver that I didn't know who this guy was and that he wasn't supposed to be in the car with me. The Uber driver, showing more assertiveness than I had, told Mark to get out. Mark complied, and I finally got some space, though the lingering tension and fear remained. At 10 p.m., as I sat in the Uber heading to my friend's place, I finally began to feel a sense of relief. I called my friend and filled her in on the unsettling encounter with Mark. She assured me she'd come outside with a group of her flatmates to meet me. The journey took longer than usual due to the one-way system in the city, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from Mark. About 10 to 15 minutes later, we arrived at my friend's place. She came over to my Uber and brought me inside to where her friends were waiting. I was still shaken, but felt a bit better now that I was surrounded by people. In the midst of catching my breath, I noticed one of her male flatmates talking to someone a little away from the group. My heart sank as I realized he was talking to Mark. I must have accidentally revealed my address when I had the Uber app open earlier. Panicking, I whispered to my friend, who immediately reacted. We hurried inside, her flatmates trailing behind us. The feeling of dread returned as we made our way into the safety of her apartment. Mark had followed me to my friend's place, and the fear that he wouldn't leave me alone was overwhelming. However, the presence of my friend and her flatmates helped me feel more secure. I decided to push aside my anxiety and try to enjoy the evening. We spent time in her kitchen chatting and having drinks, trying to create a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos of the night. At 11 p.m., as the night progressed, I managed to push the events of the earlier hours to the back of my mind. I was getting increasingly tipsy from the wine and trying to enjoy myself. However, the sense of normalcy was shattered when the kitchen door swung open and my friend's male flatmate walked in, announcing that he had invited a guy who had given him free weed. I froze as Mark stepped through the door and my stomach dropped. He walked over and, without any hesitation, put his hands around my waist from behind. I was startled but felt a surge of confidence from the wine, and I pushed him off me. Trying to keep the mood light, I joked with everyone, "Yeah, this is the guy who's been following me around all evening. I don't know him." Even surrounded by my friend's flatmates, I still didn't feel safe. Mark kept his distance, but watched me from across the kitchen. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my friends and trying to enjoy the evening. Sensing my discomfort, my friend suggested we move to her room to drink and relax. About 30 minutes after we settled in, the door suddenly slammed open, and Mark stood there, claiming he was looking for the bathroom and asking if he could use my friend's en-suite. My friend firmly told him to leave, and he did. At this point, I was exhausted by Mark's relentless presence and just wanted the night to be over. We decided to head to the club early, hoping that a change of scene would finally rid me of this unsettling encounter. At 12 a.m., we quickly gathered our things, dashed past the kitchen door, and headed outside. My friend ordered us an Uber, and we made our way to the club. As the night went on, a few of her flatmates joined us, but, thankfully, Mark was nowhere to be seen. The relief was palpable, and I tried to focus on enjoying the night. However, my financial situation meant that I couldn't afford many more drinks, and as I sobered up, the reality of the evening began to settle in. Despite the vibrant atmosphere of the club, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being shaken and creeped out by everything that had happened. I was on edge and still felt unsafe, the events of the past few hours lingering heavily in my mind. At 2 a.m., after only a few hours of trying to enjoy the club, I decided it was best to head home and get some sleep. I took an Uber back, used my key card to get into my apartment building, and went upstairs to my flat. As I was getting ready for bed, a sudden loud knock on my door jolted me. It was still early for a Friday night, so I thought it might be my boyfriend finally showing up. My door didn't have a peephole, so I walked to it in my pajamas, unlocked it, and planned to peek out to see who was there. But before I could even get the door open, it was yanked wide open with such force that I was pushed backward into my apartment. Mark stormed in, shoving me into my room, which was directly across from the front door. Panic gripped me as I realized that Mark had forced his way into my apartment. He was visibly angry and very high. He locked the door behind him and began ranting about how rude I was for not inviting him in with my friends, for ignoring him, and for not letting him in the Uber. Terrified, I ran to my bed and grabbed my phone. Mark followed, grabbing and touching me aggressively. I screamed for him to stop, and when he saw my phone, he demanded I open the camera. Shaking, I complied, and he insisted on a selfie together. He smiled as I took the picture, posing with his arms around me and kissing my cheek and neck. Then he ordered me to unlock my phone and open my messages. I sent him the selfie of us together, and he took my phone and placed it on my desk. Mark then sat at my desk for the next several hours, ranting about how rude I was, how I needed to learn manners, and how I should be with him instead of Jimmy. He claimed that his girlfriend knew he had been at my place, and now wouldn't let him go home, blaming me for it all. I tried to reason with him, begging him to leave, but he wouldn't listen. At times I would lie down on my bed or sit quietly, and each time Mark would come over, trying to touch me, kiss me, and take off my clothes. I fought him off each time, but he would get angry and return to his rants. I knew he had a history of violent crime and was terrified of provoking him. I sat there, quietly sobbing, feeling trapped and helpless, unable to call the police because he had my phone, and with my flatmates not home. My screams would be futile. At 6 a.m., as the night wore on, Mark continued to smoke more weed and take lines of whatever drug he was on, becoming increasingly disoriented and sleepy. Seizing the moment when he seemed less alert, I cautiously told him I was going to the bathroom. I noticed his eyes were half closed, and I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone from the desk, unlocked the door, and bolted from the apartment. The fear I felt while waiting for the elevator was overwhelming. I pressed the button over and over, terrified that Mark would come after me. When the elevator finally arrived, I heard Mark shouting my name from inside my apartment. The doors closed just in time, and I felt a momentary relief as I descended to the ground floor. Once outside, I dashed around the corner of the building in my pajamas, my heart racing. I managed to dial the police and explain the situation, mentioning Mark's recent release from prison. Within moments, around 5 police cars arrived. I was in a state of panic and called my boyfriend to let him know what had happened. He admitted he hadn't come to visit me the previous night because he was with another girl, and now he was hesitant to come over because he didn't want to be near the police due to having some weed on him. Despite his reluctance, I insisted he come to my place immediately. He eventually agreed, showing up reluctantly. The police began their investigation, and I tried to calm down, feeling a mix of relief and continued anxiety as they handled the situation. The aftermath police had to force their way into my apartment after Mark had locked and barricaded the door. They arrested him, but he was charged only with drug-related offenses, not for the far more serious things he did or attempted to do to me. The police explained that because I had willingly let him into my apartment earlier, and he hadn't physically assaulted me at that point, it couldn't pursue charges for sexual assault or attempted rape. This, despite the fact that he had held me hostage and tried to assault me. When I returned to my apartment, after giving my statement to the police, I found my room in disarray. Mark had thrown things around and smashed items in a fit of rage. I'm relieved I managed to escape when I did, as I shuddered to think about what might have happened if I had stayed. I don't know what became of Mark after that night. I moved out of that apartment a few months later and left the city when COVID-19 hit to ensure Mark would never find me. I stayed in my abusive relationship with Jimmy for another year before finally realizing my worth and ending it. The trauma from that night left me with severe PTSD and for months I was unable to go outside, disrupting my entire first year of university. Even now, walking alone at night is challenging for me. I understand that my story's conclusion may seem anticlimactic. I wish I could have been more assertive, but I emotionally shut down after the incident. The details of the sexual assault and attempted rape are still too painful to fully confront, but I am grateful I was able to fend him off. His intentions were clear, and he wanted to harm me. In the aftermath, I began volunteering with organizations that work with individuals convicted of sexual crimes, hoping to prevent future offenses. It's my way of advocating for others in a way I couldn't for myself. If there's one thing to take away from my story, it's this: stop being so polite. My upbringing taught me to be kind to everyone, but in this case my politeness made things worse. I regret ever agreeing to pick up drugs for my ex or letting Mark into my apartment. To Mark, I hope we never cross paths again. A few weeks ago, I started a new job at a petrol station. With years of experience from a previous job, I thought this would be easy, but working alone for 8 hours, especially during late shifts, turned out to be a different story. It all began during my afternoon shift, about half an hour in. When a man walked into the shop, I recognized him from the day before when he had asked for some shopping bags, which I had to turn down. He gave me uncomfortable vibes, but thankfully a colleague was there that day, and I asked them to handle the situation. My colleague told him we didn't have any bags, and he left. On this particular day, the same man walked in again. I thought, oh great, what does he want now? He came up to the desk and started chatting with me, asking for advice about his living situation. As he mentioned, he used to be homeless. I didn't feel comfortable giving advice, nor did I want to engage in a long conversation, so I just suggested he think things over. After he left, I realized I had made a mistake by telling him I would be off at 11 o'clock. As my shift continued, he returned around 9:30 p.m., this time with another man who looked suspicious, dressed in black with a hood up. The previous guy asked if we did phone top-ups, and something in my gut told me to make him leave. I lied and said we didn't offer that service. The two men hung around outside the store for a while. When the shop was quiet again, they came back in, and the new guy kept his hands in his pockets the entire time. I immediately feared I was about to be robbed. I stayed calm, preparing to hit the panic button under the desk if they made any aggressive moves. Fortunately, they only bought a bottle of water. I felt a huge sigh of relief, thinking they might have reconsidered robbing me, possibly due to another person waiting outside. Once they left, I quickly locked the main door using the switch to prevent them from coming back in. Half an hour later, they were still hanging around outside, and a new figure appeared, another man in black with a COVID mask. He handed out masks to the other two and went around the back of the store. Realizing the back door, which I used to go out for breaks, was vulnerable, I dashed to lock it securely. I was terrified, hiding in the office while monitoring the cameras. I tried to call the police, but struggled with the automated phone menu. In the midst of my panic, a colleague called my mobile to check on me. I explained the situation and then decided to come up with a plan. I asked my colleague to stay on the phone and keep quiet while I went to check on the intruders. I told him if I said the till is slow, he should hang up and call emergency services. I approached the window where the men were knocking. I asked them what they wanted and told them the door was locked for night mode, but I could serve them through the hatch. They requested some tobacco and a lighter. I quickly grabbed their items and passed them through the hatch, keeping a close eye on them. When they left, I was overwhelmed with relief and anxiety. I burst into tears, collapsing on the floor. Having held in my fear for so long, after that night, I demanded a change to morning shifts or I would quit. The experience was too harrowing, and I knew I couldn't go through another night like that. Last year, I had a terrifying experience that still haunts me. I had been out for drinks with friends and left around midnight since I had university the next day. My boyfriend had promised to pick me up because I don't like taking the subway alone at night. By the time I left the pub, I was pretty drunk, and since the subway closes on weekdays at night, we had no choice but to wait for the night bus. We don't live together, but near each other, both in pretty rough areas. He lives by a train station known for sketchy people and drug activity, and I live in a cheap district with a high crime rate. My building has two entrances, but I usually use the one closer to the subway for convenience. We had to take two buses to get home. After getting off the first bus, we realized we'd be waiting 20 minutes for the second one. I didn't want to stay at his place since I had class in the morning, and though sober me would never walk home late at night, drunk me was too tired to care, and my boyfriend persuaded me to walk. As we walked, we passed a few sketchy people, but nothing seemed too out of the ordinary until I saw a man walking in our direction. I had a bad feeling and told my boyfriend that I wanted to cross the street. We ignored the guy, but he started shouting "Hey" at us. His voice grew louder and angrier as we walked away. Suddenly, I noticed him coming toward us. Instinctively, I whispered, "Run," to my boyfriend, grabbed his hand, and bolted. We ran through the streets as fast as we could, making a sharp turn toward the street where I live, thinking we'd lost him. But as I fumbled with my keys at the entrance, my boyfriend panicked. He shoved me into the building's patio and slammed the door shut. He took a shortcut, he explained breathlessly. The guy had somehow guessed our route and had appeared on the other side of the street, cutting us off. If we had taken my usual entrance, he would have caught up to us easily. In the shock of the moment, we didn't call the police, which I deeply regret. For 2 weeks, I was too scared to stay at my own place and ended up staying with my boyfriend. I stopped going out for drinks for months afterward, terrified that this stranger might still be lurking somewhere. 2 weeks later, a girl just a few streets away from my apartment was raped by a man who chased her to her building. I can't help but wonder if it was the same guy who followed us that night. Thrifting is one of my favorite pastimes, if you can even call it that. It's my escape, a chance to unwind and let my mind wander as I sift through the aisles of second-hand treasures. I prefer to go alone, just me and the endless rows of knickknacks and clothes. It's therapeutic in a way, allowing me to shut out the noise and focus on something simple. For context, I'm 5 feet 5.5 and used to teach elementary school. Physically, I'm as intimidating as a soggy dishcloth. I'm also pretty quiet and mind my own business in public. So when I ventured out to a thrift store I hadn't been to before, I was in my usual zone, focused entirely on the hunt for hidden gems and paying no attention to anyone around me. That's why it took me by surprise when, out of nowhere, an older woman turned to me and snapped, "Can I help you?" At first I thought she must be talking to someone else. I looked around, confused, but it was clear she was addressing me. I shook my head and muttered a quick no, trying to brush it off and go back to what I was doing. But before I could, I overheard her in the next aisle, talking loudly to someone I assume was her friend. Oh my God, this creepy woman is following me. Every time I look up, she's there. Now, to be clear, the store was pretty crowded, and I wasn't paying any attention to this woman at all. I had my usual thrifting route. Start along the edges of the store and work my way toward the middle. There was a good chance she just happened to be in the same areas as me because, well, that's how thrift stores work. People wander in and out of the same aisles all the time, but she wasn't having it. As I tried to steer clear of her, she kept going, making louder and more aggressive comments about me. She even started telling random shoppers nearby how creepy I was, claiming I was stalking her. People started giving me strange looks, but for the most part, they didn't seem to believe her. I overheard someone mutter, her? Really, the woman wasn't backing down, though. Yeah, and I'm gonna fuck her up if I see her again. At that point, I'd had enough. I'm not a fighter, and I wasn't about to start now. So, without finishing my shopping, I put down the items I had been carrying, turned, and walked straight to my car. Something was clearly off with her, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out what it was. To the aggressive woman in the thrift store, let's not meet again. When I was around 8 to 11 years old, my sister, who's 7 years older, would babysit me whenever my parents went out. Back then, she had a heavy smoking habit, and naturally, our parents made her go outside to smoke. I'd often follow her out to the carport, which faced the street, mostly to annoy her and entertain myself while she smoked. One day, something weird happened. My sister noticed a white SUV sitting at the end of our driveway. I think it was an older model, like a mid-90s Bravada or something similar, with a bike rack on top. The windows were tinted so dark that you couldn't see inside, no matter how hard you looked. The car just sat there, idling at the end of the driveway until my sister went back inside. Then it would pull away and go park at the church lot down the street. The moment she stepped out again for another smoke, it'd come back and sit there, almost like it was waiting for her. At first, she didn't make much of it. She's always been pretty brave and didn't let things like that rattle her. But then, the next day, the same SUV came back. It parked at the end of the driveway, sitting there while she smoked. If I stayed inside, I'd peek out from the window and just see there, idling and watching her. It started to feel like we were being watched. My sister was getting uncomfortable, but tried to brush it off. Still, she told my dad about it, who was a sheriff's deputy at the time. He called the cops, filed a complaint, and they came by to check things out, but the SUV was long gone by the time they arrived. Months passed with no sign of the strange vehicle, and we began to think it was over. Then, out of nowhere, about 9 months later, the SUV returned. It became a regular occurrence again, showing up almost every time my sister went outside for a smoke. One day, she'd finally had enough. She was fed up with being watched and decided to confront whoever was inside, stay in the carport. She told me before walking down the driveway toward the SUV. As she got about halfway down, she froze. When she told us about it later, she described the feeling as utter terror, like I knew if I went any further, I was dead. I was paralyzed by pure fear. She turned around and hurried back inside, too scared to go any closer. Then came the night that everything changed. Our family car was in the shop, so we were stuck at home. My parents ordered delivery, and my sister went outside for a smoke while my mom and dad were home for once. Like clockwork, The white SUV showed up. My sister, who was used to this by now, calmly told me to run inside and tell my father. I rushed in, breathless, and told my dad what was happening. Without hesitation, my father grabbed his gun, and without leveling it at the SUV, he walked briskly down the driveway in the direction of the car. Before he even got close, the SUV floored it, tearing down the road and screeching onto the nearby highway. As a cop, my dad was quick to notice details. He knew the year and model of the SUV. But the scariest thing, the license plate had been covered in duct tape, deliberately concealed. That night was the last time we ever saw that SUV. My sister, to this day, shrugs it off like it was just some weird chapter in her life. But I'll never forget the creeping sense of dread that came with seeing that car every day. To the driver of the white SUV, whoever you were, let's not meet again. A few years ago, I was on my way to the BMV before work. For some context, my city has two main streets, Lane Avenue and Park Avenue, with several residential streets in between. I was driving south from Lane to Park when, out of nowhere, a young woman, maybe around 22 years old, ran out in front of my truck. Now, my truck was an older Ford, and it didn't have automatic locks. Before I could even react, she jumped into the passenger seat without so much as asking. It startled me, and I immediately told her to get out. Instead, she started begging for help, claiming it was her birthday. She was diabetic, and she needed me to take her back in the opposite direction, toward her home. I told her no, I had to go to work. Then, she said her boyfriend had beaten her up. I glanced at her, but she didn't have a single scratch or bruise on her. Still, I asked if she needed me to call an ambulance, especially since it was blazing hot outside and she was claiming to be diabetic. She quickly said no and begged me not to call. The whole situation felt off. She kept pleading, trying to make me turn around, and I was starting to feel uneasy. After a few minutes of this back and forth, I'd had enough. I wasn't going to be swayed. I firmly told her I wasn't going anywhere until she got out of my truck. Finally, she opened the door, jumped out, and slammed it shut. Just as I started to drive off, she yelled through the window, "Oh yeah, well, I've just been stabbed." I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the road, waiting for another car to approach. Immediately, I called 911 and explained what had happened and where she was. I figure if she really was having a diabetic episode, in that heat without food or water, she could be in serious trouble. But my instincts told me there was something more sinister going on. Living in one of the country's major human trafficking hubs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something much darker than a woman needing help. To this day, I'm thankful I trusted my gut. I shudder to think about what could have happened if I had driven her to wherever she wanted to go. A few years ago, when I was 20 and in my senior year of college, I had an experience that I'll never forget. It's mid-October, and I had just gotten out of class around 9 p.m. I decided to check out an open mic night at a local hookah lounge downtown. But when I got there, the event either wasn't happening or the place was closed. Honestly, I can't quite remember. Disappointed, I started walking back towards campus. As I made my way down one of the main streets, I came across a drunk woman, desperately pleading with two other women to give her a ride home. For some reason, they couldn't or wouldn't help her, and as they walked away, she turned to me. Now, to give you some context, I'm AFAB assigned female at birth, And while I didn't have a car at the time, I'd been living in the town for 3 years and knew the area pretty well. The woman gave me an address that was about a 15 to 20-minute walk away, and since I'd been raised to help others when I could, I figured I could walk her home and make sure she got there safely. This was the beginning of what I'd later come to regret. She was overjoyed, thanking me repeatedly for helping her. As we started walking, she mentioned she had to pee. I reassured her that her place wasn't far and she'd be home soon. She told me her boyfriend had left her at the bar, drunk and mad, and that she was from out of state. We made small talk for a while, but she started acting weird, walking too close to me or falling slightly behind. I kept trying to make her keep a bit of distance the whole time. She was getting more manic, talking about her experience with the dark web and ranting about her boyfriend. Then, as we got closer to her place, her phone rang. It was the boyfriend. He was yelling at her over the phone, being a complete jerk, so she put him on speaker. I told him to chill out, that we were almost there. His tone changed instantly, going from angry and hostile to oddly calm and friendly. That threw up a million red flags for me. My gut was screaming that something wasn't right. As we approached a gas station at the end of the road, I told her we should stop so she could use the bathroom. She said she didn't need to go anymore. I insisted, telling her that I needed to use the bathroom myself, which was partly true, but mostly an excuse to get away. Once inside the gas station, I headed straight to the bathroom and texted a friend asking if she could come pick me up. She said it'd take a little while, but she was on her way. When I came out of the bathroom, the woman was gone. She'd completely vanished from the gas station and the surrounding area. I didn't dare go looking for her. Instead, I bought a soda and waited inside the well-lit gas station, watching the door, my heart pounding. When my friend and her roommates finally arrived, I was beyond relieved. Later on, I was told that some facial dermal piercings, like the one she had on her cheekbone, are sometimes associated with human trafficking. With how the situation had played out, the way her boyfriend's tone changed, her weird behavior, and how she disappeared as soon as I got to a safe place with lights and cameras, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. A while later, I was out with friends at a drag bar, and guess who I saw? The same woman. She was sitting at a table near us, and the whole night I couldn't stop panicking. What could have happened that night if I hadn't trusted my instincts and found an exit when I did? So, to the drunk woman who may or may not have been drunk, let's not meet again. TLDR. I tried to help a drunk woman get home, only to realize something was very off. Thankfully, I got out of the situation safely, but it could have gone much worse. I came across this thread and thought I would share my experience. This happened around the time the Night Stalker show was big on Netflix, so it was fresh in our minds because we were watching it. Earlier that day, I was in my room with my dogs and my roommate when we thought we heard the front door open. We didn't think much of it at first, but a few minutes later, my roommate left the room and I heard her start screaming. Our dog that followed her was barking like crazy. The front door was wide open, and someone had apparently been inside. They must have realized we were in the room chatting and fled when they heard us. We were pretty shaken up, but we figured it was over. We locked the door and assumed that would be the end of it. Later that night, around 2 a.m., while watching the final episode of Night Stalker, we heard the doorknob jiggle. At first, we were confused, trying to process what was happening. Once it registered, my roommate started yelling for the person to go away and that the police were on their way. I hesitated because I'm not the type to call the police immediately, but then things escalated. The person started banging something against the door, trying to break it down. I grabbed my roommate, our dogs, and my partner, and we rushed into another room to put more doors between us and the intruder while calling the police. My partner wanted to go out with a sword to confront the person, but I stopped him since we had no idea what this person was armed with or what they were trying to do. Thankfully, the intruder couldn't break the door down before the police arrived, and he fled. They caught him shortly after, and he fought with them, which landed him a longer sentence than he would have had. He admitted to the police that when he broke into our house earlier, he heard women talking, but no men, which is why he came back, claiming he wanted to find a friend. The police never found the weapon he used to try to break in, but whatever it was, it messed up the metal of our door pretty badly. This happened when I was about 8 to 10 years old, and the memory still sends shivers down my spine. I've confirmed it with my mother over the years, and it disturbs us both to this day. It was a regular Saturday afternoon, and my mom and I were in town running errands. The streets were busy, with people bustling about, and we stopped at a shop we always found amusing. It sold these gaudy, old-fashioned ornaments, the kind you'd only ever see in a grandma's house. We often paused to make fun of how expensive and ugly they were, wondering how the shop even stayed in business. Being a chatty kid, I was talking nonstop, animatedly facing my mother as I babbled on about something. I clearly remember her smiling at me until her expression suddenly changed. Her face went pale, her mouth dropped open, and her eyes widened like she had just seen a ghost. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me in horror. Before I could ask her what was wrong, she grabbed my arm hard. Without a word, she yanked me away from the shop front and started pulling me into the crowd. Her grip was tight, and I immediately started protesting, saying things like, "Ouch, Mum, you're hurting me. What are you doing?" But she just kept dragging me as fast as she could without breaking into a full run. She didn't stop until we'd crossed 3 busy streets and were in a quieter part of town. Only then did she release her grip, looking visibly shaken. She rubbed my arm, clearly upset, and then looked me dead in the eyes. What she told me still makes me nauseous. While I was talking outside the shop, she had noticed an old man standing right behind me. He was dirty and disheveled, the kind of creepy old man straight out of a horror movie. At the time, I had long, pretty hair that people often complimented, especially when I wore it loose. Apparently, this man had reached out, gently lifted a handful of my hair, and brought it up to his nose, smelling it like it was some kind of perfume. I had been so absorbed in telling my story that I didn't even notice him touching me. What made it worse, my mother said, was that the moment he realized she was watching, he opened his eyes, locked them with hers, and gave her the most chilling, toothy grin. Then, in this mockingly cute way, he waggled his fingers at her, as if to say, "Whoops, caught me," before quickly dropping my hair and blending into the crowd. My mother's immediate reaction was pure instinct. She grabbed me and got us as far away from that man as fast as possible. When she told me what had happened, I was horrified. The idea that someone had been that close to me, touching me without my knowledge, made me feel sick. I had no words, even now. Every time I walk by that shop, I remember the haunted look on my mother's face. The thought of that man's sick grin still makes me shudder. So to the creepy old man who smelled my hair, let's not meet again. This experience happened a few years ago and still haunts me to this day. My boyfriend and I have been traumatized ever since. 2 years ago, I moved to the UK for university, eager to escape the toxic environment at home and start a new chapter. My first year was great. I stayed in student accommodation, met amazing people, and enjoyed my newfound independence. It was during this time that I met my boyfriend, who is still by my side today. As my second year approached, I decided to move into a house with some friends, rented through student accommodation. It was a relief to have more freedom compared to the restrictions you had in the student flats. I had a ground floor room with a window facing a small backyard. I'd often go there to smoke, as the yard was small but private, except for a rickety wooden door that opened onto the street. We had to tie the door shut with string because it wouldn't lock properly. We were surrounded by other student houses and families, but next to us lived 5 men who were definitely older than the average university student. They were odd. I first met one of them when the police were called to their house. One of his flatmates had attacked him and others with a kitchen knife, setting part of the kitchen on fire. My friends and I saw him covered in blood, cuts everywhere, and a deep wound on his head. We offered to help him clean up and gave him an old shirt to change into. After that incident, the police took the attacker away, but the whole thing left a strange feeling in the air. The guy we helped was unsettling. He constantly flirted with me and said strange things which made me uncomfortable. I later noticed he smoked a lot of weed, but we didn't think much of it at the time. Over time, I would often see him around town, but I avoided talking to him. One day, he approached me while I was heading to the corner shop. He was acting weird, and I didn't feel right, so I ignored him. That's when he said, "Oh, that's fine. I'll just wait for you in front of your house, and we can talk there." Panicked, I bought what I needed and hurried back to my street, only to find him and his flatmate sitting on my doorstep. I didn't know what to do. No one was home, and I had no way to get inside without them seeing me. I ended up waiting for them to leave nearly an hour later before rushing inside and locking the door. After that, I did my best to avoid him altogether. Then one day I went into the backyard for a smoke and noticed that the wooden door, which was always tied shut, was open. The string had been cut. I figured one of my flatmates must have forgotten to tie it back after taking the bends out, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I just closed the door and secured it again. Life went on, but the strange neighbors continued their late-night fights and yelling. One evening, my boyfriend was staying over like he usually did. We were fast asleep when he suddenly woke up to a loud bang and some whispering. He never wakes up for anything, so I knew something was wrong. He shook me awake, and we listened closely. That's when we heard the backyard door slam open, followed by footsteps right outside my window. My window was open, but thankfully the curtains were drawn. We heard someone trying to quietly open the back door, and my heart stopped. They were trying to get inside. The whispering continued, and then we heard them trying to open my window. That's when my boyfriend and I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and bolted out of the room. We ran out of the house, called my flatmates to warn them, and then immediately called the police. Thankfully, the police station was only a few streets away, and they arrived within minutes. They caught one guy in the act, and the other fled, but was found later smoking weed not far from our place. When the police searched their house, they found large amounts of meth and heroin and the men had been carrying a massive kitchen knife. I couldn't understand why they had targeted me. I had done nothing to provoke them. The thought of what they might have done if my boyfriend hadn't woken up still terrifies me. Both men were arrested, and one was sentenced to 2 years in prison for carrying a weapon with the intent to harm. I moved out a few months later, still shaken by the whole ordeal. The trauma has stayed with me. I often wake up at the slightest sound, and I still have nightmares about that night. But I'm grateful that my boyfriend was there, and we talk about it often, which helps me cope. It all began when I was 20, about 7 years ago. Over the years, I've lived on and off with my parents, depending on circumstances. Every time I stayed with them, especially when I was younger, I used to experience something strange around the same time every night. It would always be between 1 to 1:30 a.m. when I'd wake up to a soft thud, just a small, subtle sound that never seemed out of place at first. I always chalk it up to my cat jumping off the bed, or one of those moments where you jolt awake from a dream. It never truly concerned me, but it was a consistent occurrence, almost too consistent. Now, as I've gotten older, I'm back at home with my parents again while I pursue a nursing degree. I try to contribute more than just financially. I help out around the house whenever I can. And recently, I decided to take on a deeper cleaning project, scrubbing the windows, thoroughly cleaning the panes, crevices, and edges that hadn't been touched in over a decade. One afternoon, I got to the window in my room, the same window I had heard those thuds near for years. I sprayed it down with Windex, letting it sit for a moment before wiping it clean. That's when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Handprints, large handprints, smeared across the glass. They weren't just any ordinary handprints. They were massive, much larger than anyone's in our house. My father's hands are large, but these prints dwarfed his. I wear XL gloves, and these were far beyond anything that size. Whoever left these prints would need custom-made gloves for sure. I tried to rationalize it, wondering if someone could have put them there from the outside while cleaning or working on the house. But that didn't make sense. No one had been out there, not for years, and the prints were fresh. That's when I started to suspect something more disturbing was at play. To ease my paranoia and get some answers, I decided to set up a camera and a motion-triggered floodlight outside. I needed to prove to myself that I was just overthinking, that there was a logical explanation. A part of me hoped the camera would show nothing unusual, that I could dismiss the strange prints as my mind playing tricks on me. But then something did show up. A few weeks after setting up the camera, I decided to review the footage. My heart dropped as I watched. At exactly 1:14 a.m., there was a man. A shadowy figure slowly approached the driveway, moving with an eerie calmness. He didn't rush, didn't fumble. He knew exactly where he was going. The timestamp showed him standing at my window for 22 minutes. 22 minutes of him standing there, looking in, silently observing. He didn't try to break in. He didn't knock or do anything to draw attention. He just watched. His face was hard to make out in the footage, but the glow of the floodlight illuminated his outline, tall, broad, and unsettlingly still. After nearly half an hour, he simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I immediately felt the dread that had been lurking in the back of my mind for years. The thuds, the strange awakenings, the handprints, it all made sense now. This wasn't a one-time event. Someone had been watching me, maybe for years, and I'd been blissfully unaware of it. The next morning, I went back to my window. I sprayed it again, and there they were. Fresh handprints, his handprints. I couldn't believe it. I had never felt so vulnerable. so exposed in my own home. I contacted the police immediately, explaining everything I had seen and experienced. They came to the house, took my statement, and reviewed the footage. But since he hadn't done anything besides stand there, they couldn't do much. They assured me they'd increase patrols in the area, but I knew that wouldn't give me much peace of mind. We've since installed a driveway alarm and increased our security around the house. Every night now I double-check every lock, every door, every window. The mere thought of that man standing there, silently watching me for so long, sends shivers down my spine. I've learned to live with the unease, but the paranoia still lingers. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, lurking somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. It's been months since the last incident, but I'm constantly on edge, waiting for that soft thud or the distant alarm that tells me he's come back to the man who watched me from my own window. I hope we never meet, not in this life or the next. Stay far away. This past weekend, my friends and I had an experience in the woods that still makes my skin crawl. For a little context, we often like to escape into the more forested parts of our state to unwind. It's quiet, peaceful, and there's something about the thick trees and isolation that we find comforting. There's this one road in particular that we frequent, a long, desolate stretch with no houses, no street lights, just endless woods on either side. It's miles away from civilization, making it the perfect spot for us to hang out without any interruptions. One night, it was just me and one friend who had never been down this road before. Naturally, I wanted to show him the place, so we set off, driving deeper and deeper into the forest. As we were cruising down the dark road, my headlights caught a reflection up ahead, something metallic like a license plate. That was strange because cars never come down this road, especially not at night. Curiosity piqued. I slowed down, and as we got closer, I realized it was a brand new Mustang parked on the side of the road. There were no other cars around, no signs of anyone needing help, but the sight of it unsettled me for some reason. We didn't stick around long. I just turned the car around and headed home. The next weekend rolled around, and this time I brought the usual group of friends who knew the road as well as I did. We headed back to the same area, and sure enough, the Mustang was still there, but now it was parked in a different spot. This time there was a white towel hanging out of the window. We thought it might be a signal that someone needed help, so we pulled over to check it out. The car looked pristine, brand new, inside and out. Nothing about it seemed out of place, except for the fact that it was here, in the middle of nowhere. We shrugged it off, but something about it stuck in our heads. The next day, we returned. Once again, the Mustang had moved to a new spot along the road, still with the white towel in the window. Now things were getting weird. I decided to take a picture of the license plate and run them later, but as we were parked near the car, we realized something odd. This particular spot on the road had zero cell service, no calls, no texts, no GPS. It was like a dead zone. Feeling uneasy, we decided to leave and drive to a spot with service to check the plates. When we did, nothing came up. The car wasn't registered, or at least, it wasn't in any system we could access. That's when we decided to stake it out. We had to know who or what was behind this mystery. That night, we returned to the road and parked about 100 feet from the Mustang. We sat in the car, waiting, watching. After a while, my friend and I decided to get out and take a closer look with our flashlights. As we approached the Mustang, the forest around us seemed eerily quiet. No crickets, no whine, just dead silence. We looked at the car again. Nothing new. Then we heard its soft whispers, like someone was nearby, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. Feeling brave or maybe foolish, we walked into a small clearing in the woods, calling out, "Hello, and we like your Mustang," trying to be light-hearted about the whole situation. But then we heard it. Faint footsteps behind us. At first, we thought it was just our friends messing with us, so we started walking back toward the car. As we moved, the footsteps behind us grew louder, quicker, matching our pace. We sprinted back to the car, breathless. Our friends swore they hadn't moved, and there was no way we could have heard them from that distance. Still rattled, my friend who was driving decided to pull the car closer to the Mustang, shining the headlights directly on it. One of my friends, half joking, started recording a video as we scanned the area. When we played back the video, the joke was over. There, standing in the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was hard to make out, but you could clearly see a person in the distance, standing still, watching us. And just behind him, barely visible behind a tree, was another figure. I know this sounds hard to believe, but I swear it's all true. We've all watched that video over and over again, and it sends chills down my spine every time. I don't know who those people were, what they were doing, or why that Mustang kept showing up on that road. But one thing's for sure, we won't be going back there anytime soon, and to the mysterious figures hiding in the woods near that Mustang, let's never meet. This happened a while ago, but it still messes with my mind to this day. A bit of background: I live in a quiet countryside town where nothing much happens. I'm an 18-year-old girl who feels safe walking around alone, even at night, because there are almost no crimes here. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and trouble is rare. One evening, as usual, I took my dog for a walk. The weather was perfect, so I decided to head out to a nearby field. I often let my dog off her leash there, and she loves running around. Everything seemed normal at first, but as we walked, I couldn't shake this odd feeling in my gut. It was strange, like an alarm going off in my head. The last time I felt something like this was when I was 8 years old, riding in the car with my family. I remember telling my parents that I had a bad feeling and they should be careful. My dad slowed down, and a minute later, a deer ran out in front of our car. We would have hit it if we hadn't slowed down. That memory has stuck with me ever since. Back in the field, 10 years later, I felt that same gut feeling. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. My dog and I wandered around the fields and near the forest. As the sun began to set, I decided to head home, choosing a shortcut through a small forest path. It wasn't a popular route, but it was quicker, and I didn't want to be out too late. As I walked toward the edge of the forest, I noticed a silhouette at the end of the path. At first, I didn't think much of it and kept walking, but something about it made me stop. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. It looked small from a distance, so I assumed it was a child waiting for someone. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a child. It was a grown man, riding a small child's bike. The bike was way too small for him, and he was awkwardly perched on it, his long legs bent at odd angles. He looked completely out of place, like he didn't belong there at all. Despite the unsettling sight, I kept walking, telling myself I was just overreacting. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or maybe his bike had broken down. But as I got closer, he didn't move, just kept staring at me with the creepiest, widest smile I've ever seen. His expression was filled with some twisted excitement, and he started bouncing up and down on the tiny bike like he was too giddy to stay still. That's when the panic set in. I glanced behind me. There was no one else around, just me, an 18-year-old girl with a small fluffy dog, who was definitely not a guard dog. I thought about turning back, but decided to just jog in the other direction. I didn't want to risk passing him. When I glanced back, I was relieved to see that he wasn't following me. I felt like an idiot for getting so scared and started to calm down. We were almost at the end of the field, with just a short stretch of forest left before we'd be home. My dog was running off-leash, enjoying herself. That's when, out of nowhere, she bolted off towards something in the distance. I panicked because she had never done that before. I called her name over and over, my heart racing. Eventually, she came back, but as I clipped the leash back on her collar, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was him, the man on the tiny bike. He was pedaling straight toward me through the field. He wasn't looking at where he was going. His eyes were locked on me. His face was twisted into that same insane grin, and he was struggling to bike through the muddy field, but he kept coming. My heart was pounding in my chest. How had he followed me so far without me noticing? And why was he still coming after me? I didn't wait to find out. I took off running as fast as I could. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running. I could hear him struggling behind me, trying to keep up on that ridiculous bike. I glanced back once, and he was still there, grinning, his body jerking awkwardly as he tried to ride through the mud. I ran until I reached the edge of a nearby house. Without thinking, I dashed into their yard, hiding behind some bushes. I stayed there, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for him to appear. But he never did. After a while, I peeked out from my hiding spot. He was gone. I ran the rest of the way home, terrified he might still be lurking somewhere in the shadows. By the time I reached an area with other houses and people, I felt a little safer, but the fear didn't go away. I wanted to call 911, but I didn't have any proof, and I was too afraid to tell my parents. They're already overprotective, and if they knew what happened, they'd probably never let me leave the house again. Ever since that night, I've been paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. My dog, who was usually fearless, seemed skittish too. I can't shake the image of that man and his horrible smile. I keep expecting to see him lurking in the distance or peering through my window. I don't know what he wanted or what he would have done if he caught me, but I'm grateful I never had to find out. One thing is for sure, I'll never ignore my gut feeling again.